2 weeks after my daughter threw an $80,000 engagement party, the event coordinator called me and said she had recorded something deeply disturbing. She told me to come alone and not to tell my daughter a single word. What she played for me changed absolutely everything. I am Tyrone Rollins, 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building a commercial real estate empire in Atlanta to protect my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who smiled in your face while plotting behind your back. I walked into the secluded downtown Atlanta coffee shop just before noon. The autumn air was crisp and clear, but the atmosphere inside felt instantly suffocating the moment I saw Carmen sitting in the back booth. Carmen was the event coordinator I had hired for Morgan's engagement gala. She was a sharp, observant professional who never wasted time, and her rigid posture today told me this was not a casual social visit. I slid into the booth across from her. She did not offer a polite greeting or ask how my day was going. She simply pushed her phone across the polished wooden table. Her hands were completely steady, but her eyes held a complex mixture of pity and urgent warning. She explained that she had been reviewing the security footage from the venue's VIP room to clear up a minor billing dispute with the catering staff. Instead of finding missing inventory or misplaced equipment, she found a private conversation that took place long after the main reception had ended. I stared at the phone screen resting between us. The video was paused on the faces of my future son-in-law, Blake Kensington, and his parents, Charles and Patricia. Carmen leaned forward and told me to listen very carefully. She had extracted the audio files directly from the main security server. The party had cost me $80,000, a massive sum I had paid without a second thought just to see my daughter smile. I pressed play, expecting to hear drunk banter or perhaps petty complaints about the service. I was absolutely not prepared for the pure venom that poured from the speaker. The recording started with the unmistakable sound of clinking crystal glasses. Charles Kensington's voice echoed, first heavily slurred with expensive scotch and unearned arrogance. He laughed loudly, a grating, cruel sound that filled the small VIP room. I listened closely as Charles mocked the entire evening, specifically targeting my African-American heritage with a casual cruelty that made my jaw tighten. He called me a clueless old workhorse with an open wallet, joking that my money was the only respectable thing about my bloodline. Patricia chimed in immediately, laughing at the way I had greeted their country club friends earlier in the evening. She called my hospitality a pathetic, desperate attempt to buy my way into their upper-class circle. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. I only paid for this extravagant party because Blake had sat in my living room weeks prior, looking me directly in the eye with a flawless mask of humility. He had claimed his own millions were temporarily frozen in a revolutionary tech startup launch. He promised to reimburse me the very moment his venture capital cleared. Morgan, my brilliant orthopedic surgeon of a daughter, had looked at him with such blind, absolute adoration that I wrote the check immediately. I had spent 40 years turning a single dilapidated laundromat into a prime real estate portfolio precisely so my child would never have to beg or feel lesser than anyone else. Hearing the Kensingtons mock that lifetime of brutal labor as the foolish generosity of a gullible old man did not ignite a sudden explosive rage. Instead, it triggered a deep, calculating clarity. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, refusing to let my emotions override my logic. The racial slurs and the elitist mockery were infuriating, but I quickly realized they were merely the overture to a much darker and far more dangerous agenda. The laughter on the recording slowly subsided, replaced by a sinister, conspiratorial tone. Blake's voice cut through the background noise, sharp-focused and entirely sober. He instructed his parents to keep their voices down before boasting about his real accomplishment of the night. He had successfully manipulated Morgan into signing a blank financial guarantee document. He bragged about how remarkably easy it was, detailing how she trusted him implicitly when he claimed it was just routine paperwork required to set up their future joint accounts. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Morgan held a temporary financial power of attorney over my entire estate. I had granted her that sweeping legal authority 2 years ago when I underwent a severe open-heart surgery, ensuring the business would run smoothly if I did not wake up from the procedure. I had never revoked it because I trusted her with my life and my legacy. Blake knew this detail perfectly well. He explained to his parents that with Morgan's signature on that specific blank guarantee, he possessed the legal leverage to force a transfer of my flagship commercial building into a holding company controlled entirely by the Kensington family. He chuckled darkly, telling his father that the old workhorse would soon be permanently out of the picture, and the prime Atlanta real estate would secure the Kensington legacy forever. They were not just insulting me behind closed doors. They were actively executing a hostile takeover of everything I owned, using my own daughter's blind love as their primary weapon. Carmen watched me closely from across the table, perhaps expecting me to shout, to slam my fist down, or to break down in betrayal. I did none of those things. The man who scrubbed floors at 25 to build an empire does not waste precious energy on useless tantrums. I quietly locked the phone screen and slid the device back to her. I looked her directly in the eyes and thanked her for her integrity. I promised her that her loyalty would not be forgotten and that she would be rewarded for bringing this to light. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked out of the coffee shop into the bright, glaring Atlanta sunlight. My daughter was in severe danger. My life's work was under direct attack. The time for playing the generous, accommodating father-in-law was permanently over. The hunt had officially begun. I did not reach for my phone to call Morgan. Confronting my daughter right now would be a massive tactical error. It would only give Blake the advantage of time and the ultimate shield of her blind affection. Instead, I merged onto the highway and drove my sedan straight into the bustling heart of downtown Atlanta. The midday traffic crawled along Peachtree Street, but my mind operated with cold, calculated precision. Every stoplight gave me a moment to refine my next move. I pulled into the reserved executive parking bay of my private bank, cut the engine, and walked through the heavy glass double doors with a singular focus. I bypassed the row of busy tellers and the polite customer service representatives who usually rushed forward to offer me coffee. I marched directly to the glass-walled office of the branch manager. He stood up immediately. His practiced, professional smile faltered the instant he registered the uncompromising, stony expression on my face. I stepped inside, closed the heavy door behind me, and turned the lock. I did not offer a polite greeting or ask about his family. I took a seat in the leather chair opposite his desk and instructed him to pull up my entire financial portfolio right this second. I demanded a comprehensive line-by-line audit of every single pending transaction, transfer, or credit application attached to my name or any of my holding companies. The manager swallowed hard, clearly sensing the severe tension in the room, and his hands moved rapidly over his keyboard. The air in the office grew thick and heavy as the computer screen refreshed. I sat perfectly still, watching the reflection of the data scrolling across his lenses, waiting to find the exact legal weapon Blake intended to use against me. The manager stopped typing. His face completely drained of color as he stared at the primary dashboard. He cleared his throat, his hands shaking slightly as he nervously turned the monitor to face me. He pointed a trembling finger at a pending commercial loan application filed just 48 hours ago. The requested disbursement amount was an astonishing $3 million. I leaned forward and scanned the digital paperwork, my eyes instantly locking onto the designated collateral. It was my flagship office building on West Peachtree. That property was the absolute crown jewel of my real estate empire and the secure foundation of my entire net worth. The application was fully processed, actively sitting in the queue and waiting for final underwriter approval. I asked the manager in a dangerously calm voice who had initiated the loan. He clicked a few buttons and pulled up the authorization logs. The initial request had been officially submitted by Morgan. Seeing her name legally attached to this massive theft felt like a physical blow to my chest, but the mechanics of the betrayal immediately clicked into logical place. 2 years ago, I had collapsed in my office and required severe emergency open-heart surgery. The surgeons gave me a terrifyingly low chance of survival. Hours before they put me under anesthesia, my attorney quickly drafted a temporary financial power of attorney. I granted Morgan complete sweeping legal authority over my assets to ensure my employees would be paid and the business would survive if I did not wake up. I survived the grueling surgery, recovered fully, and simply forgot to officially revoke the document because I trusted my only child with my life. Blake had clearly rummaged through her personal files and discovered that massive legal loophole. He was exploiting Morgan's dormant legal authority to hijack my building from the inside. He had somehow convinced her to authorize the initial phase of the loan, manipulating her trust completely under the guise of funding his fake tech startup. The manager looked at me with deep professional concern, offering to freeze the application and lock down the accounts immediately. I raised my hand to stop him. Freezing the loan right now would instantly alert Blake that I knew his plan, causing him to scatter, or find a more destructive avenue of attack. I needed to keep his illusion of control perfectly intact. I instructed the manager to leave the application exactly as it was. I needed to see precisely how Blake planned to execute the final lethal step of his theft. I demanded to know the exact status of the final approval. The manager brought up the underwriting requirements. He explained that because of the sheer magnitude of the $3 million loan and the specific corporate structuring of my flagship property, Morgan's power of attorney was not sufficient to finalize the disbursement. The bank required one final physical signature from me as the primary title holder. Without my direct authorization on the final page of the guarantee document, the funds would never be released. Furthermore, the underwriting department had placed a strict deadline on the application. The paperwork had to be fully executed and submitted by this Friday at 5 in the afternoon, or the loan request would automatically expire and trigger a mandatory fraud review. The timeline was incredibly tight. Blake was running out of time. He needed my signature immediately, which meant he would have to face me to get it. Right at that exact moment, the heavy silence in the office was broken by a sharp buzz. My phone vibrated intensely against the polished wood of the desk. I picked it up and stared at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Blake. The tone of his message was sickeningly sweet, a masterful display of false affection. He wrote that he and Morgan wanted to treat me to a very special private dinner tonight at the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. He claimed it was long overdue family bonding time and that he had a wonderful surprise to share with me regarding his business. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive. The trap was beautifully set. Blake believed I was nothing more than a gullible old man who would gladly sign away his life's work over a medium-rare steak and a glass of expensive wine. He thought his charming persona would blind me to the reality of the document he planned to slide across the table. I looked at the manager who was watching me with silent apprehension. I put my phone back down. I did not feel a shred of anxiety. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a man preparing for war. I unlocked my phone, opened the message thread, and typed a highly enthusiastic, polite acceptance to my future son-in-law. I told him I would be absolutely delighted to join them for dinner, and that I was looking forward to hearing all about his new business ventures. I sent the message, pocketed my phone, and stood up from the leather chair. I thanked the manager for his absolute discretion and explicitly ordered him not to flag the account or breathe a word of this visit to anyone. I walked out of the bank with my head held high. Blake Kensington wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception with my family's legacy. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about what happens when you try to steal from a man who built his empire from nothing. The reservation was at a high-end steakhouse where the lighting was deliberately low and the cuts of meat cost more than a decent car payment. I arrived exactly on time. Blake and Morgan were already seated at a secluded corner booth. Blake stood up immediately, offering a blindingly white, perfectly rehearsed smile. He pulled out my chair with exaggerated deference. I sat down, maintaining a calm, unreadable expression. Blake signaled the sommelier before I even opened the menu. He ordered a bottle of Cabernet that easily ran 4 figures. He played the ultimate host, leaning across the white tablecloth to pour my wine himself. He praised my suit. He asked about my drive. He spun a flawless illusion of a man who deeply respected his future father-in-law. I watched my daughter across the table. Morgan beamed with absolute pride. Her eyes darted between Blake and me, silently thrilled that her 2 favorite men were bonding. She spent her days performing grueling orthopedic surgeries, putting shattered bones back together with absolute precision. Yet sitting here, she was entirely blind to the fracture right in front of her. She reached over and squeezed Blake's arm, completely oblivious to the predatory calculation hiding behind his tailored Italian suit. I took a slow sip of the wine. It tasted like ash, but I complimented the vintage. I let Blake steer the conversation. I let him inflate his ego with hollow stories about his tech startup. I fed his arrogance with deliberate nods. A predator always strikes when he believes his prey is completely relaxed. I simply waited for him to make his move. The waiter cleared our appetizer plates and the atmosphere shifted. Blake wiped his mouth, cleared his throat, and reached down into his leather briefcase. He produced a thick, embossed folder and placed it gently next to my wine glass. He folded his hands together, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured concern. He told me he had been speaking with some elite wealth managers about the changing tax laws. He called the document a family trust protection plan. He spun a masterful tale about shielding my commercial assets from federal inheritance penalties. He looked at me with fake empathy and suggested that managing such a massive real estate portfolio was entirely too much stress for a man of my age. He claimed this document would legally streamline everything, allowing me to finally relax and let the younger generation handle the heavy lifting. Morgan nodded enthusiastically. She leaned across the table and placed her soft hand over mine. She told me Blake had spent weeks consulting with his startup investors to draw up this specific protection plan just for me. She pleaded with me to trust his financial genius. She reminded me of my heart surgery 2 years ago, her voice trembling slightly with genuine fear for my health. She said I had worked hard enough for one lifetime and that I deserved to rest. Every word she spoke was a weapon Blake had handed her. He was using my daughter's genuine love and fear for my mortality as a crowbar to pry open my vault. I looked down at the document. The pages were dense with complex legal jargon, but I did not need to read the fine print. Jonathan Pierce had already warned me. This was the irrevocable transfer of ownership. If my pen touched that signature line, my flagship building would legally belong to a holding company controlled by the Kensington family by morning. Blake handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He smiled, a perfectly calculated expression of reassurance. The trap was fully sprung, its steel jaws waiting for my hand. I took the heavy gold pen from his outstretched hand. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. I felt the cold, hard weight of anger pressing against my ribs, but I forced it down into a tightly sealed box. Firing my rage across the table would only validate Morgan's fear that I was growing volatile and hostile. It would drive her straight into Blake's arms. I needed a tactical demolition, not an emotional explosion. I held the pen above the paper and let my hand begin to shake. I manufactured a severe, uncontrollable tremor in my fingers. I reached for my wine glass with my other hand, pretending to need a drink to steady my nerves. My fingers clumsily clipped the stem of the crystal glass. A full pour of vintage Cabernet swept violently across the table. The dark red liquid flooded the open folder, soaking instantly through the thick legal paper. The wine obliterated the text and completely ruined the signature pages. Blake jumped out of his chair. For a fraction of a second, his polished, charming mask completely shattered. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed across his face. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he stared at the destroyed document. He snatched the dripping papers from the table, cursing under his breath before forcing his polite smile back into place. Morgan quickly handed me a cloth napkin, apologizing profusely and asking if my chest was hurting. I reassured her in a weak, tired voice that it was just a minor spasm in my hand. Blake gripped the ruined folder to his chest. He stated tightly that the restaurant manager would surely have a printer in the back office. He excused himself, practically sprinting toward the hallway to salvage his stolen fortune. In his blind panic, he left his cell phone resting face up next to his untouched steak. I wiped the spilled wine from my cuffs. The screen of Blake's phone suddenly lit up with an incoming text message. I leaned forward slightly. The notification banner displayed a message from an unsaved number. It read that the final extension had expired and the collection team was coming to collect the principal plus interest by tomorrow night. The sender promised severe physical consequences if the debt was not settled in full. A cold realization washed over me. Blake was not merely a greedy opportunist. He was a desperate man drowning in dangerous illegal debt. His flashy tech startup was nothing more than a hollow shell game, and he had borrowed money from people who broke bones for a living. He needed my commercial building to save his own life. The stakes were no longer just financial. I sat back in my chair sipping my water as Morgan fussed over the spilled wine. I knew exactly how to destroy him. I did not wait for Blake to return with a fresh copy of his poison. I signaled the waiter, dropped a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover the spilled wine, and turned to Morgan. I told my daughter I was feeling a sudden, intense wave of exhaustion. My daughter immediately shifted into her protective medical mode, insisting I go straight home to rest and offering to drive me herself. I assured her I was perfectly fine to drive, kissed her forehead, and seamlessly slipped the wine-soaked leather folder under my arm. I walked out of the steakhouse just as Blake emerged from the hallway, his hands empty and his face entirely pale. I gave him a curt nod, cited my failing energy, and stepped into the cool Atlanta night before he could utter a single protest or demand his folder back. I did not drive home. I steered my car directly toward the financial district, navigating the glowing city streets with absolute clarity. The towering glass structure of my attorney's firm pierced the night sky, a fortress of legal power. Gregory Thorne was the kind of ruthless corporate lawyer who billed by the minute and seemingly never slept. I took the private, secure elevator straight to his penthouse office. Thorne was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk reviewing a complex merger agreement. He looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as I walked in unannounced. I tossed the damp, ruined folder directly onto his pristine desk. The red wine had warped the heavy parchment, but the venomous legal clauses remained entirely legible. I ordered Thorne to read the document immediately and tell me exactly how my future son-in-law intended to rob me. The silence in the office stretched out heavily, broken only by the crisp sound of pages turning. Thorne was a man who had witnessed every conceivable flavor of corporate greed throughout his career. Yet I watched his jaw tighten visibly as he scanned the paragraphs. He grabbed a yellow highlighter and began circling specific sections of the text, tracing the lethal traps Blake had carefully hidden beneath the guise of family protection. Thorne finally looked up at me, his expression hardening into absolute professional fury. He stated clearly that this was not a standard trust agreement or a protective tax shield. It was a financial guillotine designed to execute my legacy. Thorne pushed the ruined document back across the desk and explained the sheer brutality of the contract. Blake had disguised an irrevocable transfer of ownership within standard asset protection jargon. If my pen had touched that signature line at the restaurant, I would have instantly forfeited every single legal right to my own commercial real estate portfolio. The hidden clauses granted Blake immediate, uncontested executive control over a newly formed holding company. Thorne clarified that by tomorrow morning, Blake would have possessed the absolute legal authority to liquidate my flagship office building and siphon the resulting funds directly into offshore accounts. He could sell the very foundation of my legacy without requiring any further consent from me, leaving me entirely powerless to stop the transaction or recover the capital. Listening to Thorne detail the cold mechanics of the theft, I felt a familiar gritty resolve harden inside my chest. I was 69 years old, sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse office, but my empire did not start in the boardroom. I vividly remembered being 25 years old, taking every single penny I had to my name to purchase a rundown laundromat on the south side of the city. I spent my nights scrubbing those cracked linoleum floors until my knuckles bled, breathing in harsh bleach and cheap detergent, while repairing broken washing machines with salvaged parts. I built this wealth brick by brick, sacrificing sleep and comfort to ensure my family would never know the bitter, crushing weight of poverty. Morgan grew up taking expensive ballet lessons and attending a premier medical school solely because I spent decades turning that single laundromat into a dominant portfolio of prime commercial properties. Blake Kensington, a man whose only discernible talent was pitching empty promises to gullible investors, wanted to steal 40 years of my blood and sweat with a single stroke of a fountain pen. He viewed my life's work as a convenient bailout for his pathetic failures. Thorne interrupted my thoughts, tapping his pen against the desk. He leaned forward and told me the fraudulent contract was actually the least of my immediate worries. The lawyer had already taken the liberty of running a quiet, deep background check on Blake the moment I had called him from the car. He wanted to fully understand the adversary we were dealing with. What Thorne found elevated the situation from a simple financial scam to a direct, terrifying threat to my personal freedom. Thorne turned his computer monitor to face me, displaying a series of recent, highly suspicious bank transfers originating from Blake's rapidly dwindling business account. Over the past 3 weeks, Blake had wired significant sums of money to a man named Simon Blackwood. Thorne explained that Blackwood was not an investor or a legitimate tech consultant. He was a disgraced former psychiatrist who had his medical license permanently revoked by the state medical board 3 years ago for accepting bribes to falsify patient evaluations. Thorne's voice dropped to a grim, urgent register as he laid out Blake's contingency plan with chilling clarity. The ruined signature tonight was merely a temporary setback for a desperate man owing money to violent loan sharks. Blake knew that forcing me to sign another document would be nearly impossible now that my suspicions were likely aroused. Therefore, he was actively preparing his ultimate weapon. Thorne warned me that Blake intended to bypass my legal consent entirely by filing for an emergency guardianship order in family court. He planned to use Blackwood to generate a fraudulent medical certificate declaring me completely mentally incompetent, stating I was suffering from severe violent dementia. With Morgan already primed to believe my health was failing rapidly, Blake would use her medical authority and his fake documents to petition a judge to freeze my assets and grant him full conservatorship over my life. He wanted to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me in a secure assisted living facility while he dismantled my real estate empire to pay his underground debts. The sheer malice of the plan was breathtaking. Blake was not just coming for my bank accounts. He was coming for my autonomy, my dignity, and my sanity. Thorne asked me what my immediate instructions were. He offered to call the federal authorities and file an immediate injunction to block any legal maneuvers from the Kensington family. I shook my head standing up from the heavy leather chair. A defensive maneuver would merely delay the inevitable and alert Blake to our knowledge. I needed to crush Blake's offensive capabilities completely and permanently. I told Thorne to prepare the paperwork for a total impenetrable asset lockdown. I had to prove my absolute mental clarity before Blake's fake doctor could strike his first blow. The true war was starting right now. The sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when I began executing the counteroffensive. I did not afford myself the luxury of sleep or hesitation. By 7 in the morning, I was seated in the waiting room of the most fiercely accredited neurologist in the state. I had instructed Pierce to leverage every ounce of his firm's considerable influence to secure emergency same-day appointments with 3 separate, entirely independent medical professionals across the city. If Blake intended to weaponize my age against me, I needed a medical fortress that no disgraced, unlicensed fraud could ever penetrate. I spent the next 6 hours undergoing the most grueling, comprehensive cognitive examinations of my entire life. They mapped my brainwaves, tested my memory recall under extreme pressure, and bombarded me with complex psychological evaluations designed to detect even the faintest shadow of cognitive decline. I sat in brightly lit, sterile clinical rooms answering rapid-fire questions about my medical history, my spatial awareness, and my executive functioning. I recounted the exact date I purchased my first commercial property, the precise square footage of that original rundown laundromat, and the exact interest rate on the initial loan that started my empire. Decades of memorizing dense zoning laws, negotiating cutthroat commercial leases, and managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio had kept my mind functioning like a perfectly calibrated machine. I did not stumble once. Each highly credentialed doctor, completely unaware of the other 2 I was seeing that day, concluded the exact same thing. They handed me signed, officially notarized certificates of absolute mental clarity. The legal documents stated unequivocally that I possessed the cognitive function of a man decades younger, fully capable of managing my own complex financial and personal affairs without any outside assistance. I folded these heavily stamped certificates into my breast pocket. They were my armor against the coming assault. I now possessed irrefutable scientific proof that any claim of my mental incompetence was a malicious, actionable fabrication. Blake's emergency guardianship strategy was effectively dead on arrival, provided I could keep him stalling just a little bit longer. While I was fortifying my mind, Jonathan Pierce was ruthlessly fortifying my assets. I drove straight from the final medical clinic back to Pierce's high-rise office to initiate the legal lockdown. We had no time for standard bureaucratic delays or polite negotiations. Pierce had spent the entire night drafting the dense paperwork required to transfer my complete real estate portfolio, including the flagship commercial building Blake so desperately coveted, into a highly complex, impenetrable blind trust. This specific legal structure was an absolute financial fortress, designed for high-net-worth individuals facing hostile litigation. Once activated, the assets would legally vanish from public record. I would no longer be the direct documented owner of the empire I had built from the ground up over 40 years. My name would be entirely scrubbed from the deeds, replacing me with a faceless, untraceable corporate trustee entity. The sheer brilliance of this maneuver was that it instantly neutralized the temporary power of attorney Morgan currently held. Blake could manipulate my daughter into signing 1,000 blank guarantee documents, but she could not legally authorize a commercial loan against a building that no longer belonged to me on paper. Pierce slid the massive stack of transfer documents across his expansive desk. I signed my name dozens of times, officially relinquishing direct control of my life's work simply to protect it from a parasite. Pierce stamped the final page and immediately dispatched his senior paralegals to file the transfers directly with the state registry. We were building an invisible wall right in front of Blake's face. However, Pierce gave me a grim, uncompromising warning as he gathered the sealed files. The state financial system was notoriously slow and burdened with red tape, The blind trust required exactly 48 hours to clear the municipal databases and become an unassailable legal reality. For the next 2 days, my portfolio was still completely vulnerable. If Blake managed to execute his emergency guardianship order before the trust finalized, he could potentially freeze the asset transfer and trap my entire legacy in probate hell. I had to run out the clock by any means necessary. I left Pierce's office with a hardened sense of purpose and drove back to my private estate in Buckhead. I needed to maintain my daily routine perfectly to avoid tipping my hand. I turned onto my long, tree-lined driveway expecting to find an empty, quiet house where I could finally rest and prepare for the next phase of the war. Instead, my jaw tightened as I pulled up to the front gates. Parked directly in front of my porch was Blake's sleek silver sports car. I cut the engine and stepped out of my vehicle, my expression instantly locking into a flawless mask of mild, welcoming confusion. Blake was not alone. He was sitting on my expensive patio furniture, casually sipping a glass of iced water as if he owned the property. Beside him sat a strange, severely dressed man clutching a battered leather briefcase to his chest. The stranger had a nervous, darting energy completely at odds with Blake's manufactured, relaxed calm. I recognized the man instantly from the background dossier Pierce had compiled the night before. It was Simon Blackwood, the disgraced former psychiatrist Blake had hired on the black market to forge my medical records. Blake stood up the moment I approached the steps, flashing that same sickeningly charming smile he had worn at the steakhouse. He did not mention the ruined documents, the spilled wine, or the catastrophic dinner. He smoothly transitioned directly into his backup plan. Blake stepped forward and placed a seemingly affectionate, heavy hand on my shoulder. He told me that Morgan had been terribly worried about my sudden exhaustion the night before. He claimed they had discussed my health at length and decided it was best to bring a private, elite, holistic wellness coach directly to the house to monitor my stress levels. The absolute audacity of the lie was staggering. He had brought a paid criminal to my front door to declare me insane in my own home. I looked at Blake, then at the nervous fraud clutching his briefcase. The 48-hour clock on my blind trust was ticking, and the enemy had breached my perimeter. I smiled warmly, unlocking my front door and inviting the parasites inside. I ushered them into the expansive marble foyer of my home. Blake stepped inside with an exaggerated swagger, immediately launching into his rehearsed script. He claimed Morgan had been tossing and turning all night, sick with worry about my sudden fatigue at the steakhouse. To ease her mind, he had taken the liberty of bringing along his associate Simon Blackwood. Blake introduced the nervous, sweating man not as a medical professional, but as an elite, holistic wellness coach who specialized in senior vitality and cognitive longevity. The lie was so perfectly delivered I almost commended him for his performance. Blackwood did not offer a handshake. He immediately invaded my personal space, stepping entirely too close and staring intensely into my eyes. This was the first tactic of psychological destabilization. He bypassed any polite introductory conversation and launched a barrage of rapid-fire, disorienting questions. He asked me what I had eaten for breakfast last Tuesday, immediately interrupting my answer to demand I spell the word cognitive backward. Before I could finish the spelling, he forcefully asked if I knew the current interest rate on my primary mortgage, and followed it up by asking what color the car parked across the street was. The strategy was brutally transparent. Blackwood was attempting to overload my short-term memory and induce a state of artificial confusion. He wanted me to stumble, to hesitate, or to show a flash of irritation. If I grew angry and kicked them out, Blake could report to Morgan that I was experiencing the volatile mood swings typical of severe dementia. If I became flustered by the disjointed interrogation, Blackwood would use that hesitation as clinical proof of cognitive decline. The fake wellness coach leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing, soothing whisper. He asked if I often felt lost in my own home, and if the walls ever felt like they were closing in on me. I realized then the true danger of what Blake had orchestrated. He had brought a predator into my sanctuary to dismantle my reality brick by brick. I did not back away or raise my voice in protest. I smiled graciously, thanked Blake for his remarkable concern, and guided them both into the formal sitting room. I gestured for them to take a seat on the velvet sofa, while I moved to the antique credenza to prepare a pot of loose-leaf Darjeeling tea. As I poured the boiling water, I slid my phone out of my pocket. With a swift, practiced motion, I activated the high-definition recording application and placed the device face down on the glass coffee table directly between us. The microphone was now capturing every single unethical trap Blackwood was attempting to set. I handed them their porcelain teacups with perfectly steady hands. Blackwood immediately resumed his aggressive line of questioning, asking me to subtract 7 sequentially from 100. I took a slow sip of my tea. Instead of playing his childish arithmetic game, I looked him dead in the eye and delivered a flawless, unprompted recitation of the exact closing figures from my last 3 commercial acquisitions. I detailed the precise square footage, the initial asking prices, the final negotiated settlement amounts down to the decimal point, and the complex zoning variances I had navigated to secure the permits. I did not stop there. I seamlessly transitioned into a detailed historical analysis of the Atlanta skyline, citing the specific architects, the dates of construction, and the structural failures of the surrounding buildings in the financial district. I spoke with a razor-sharp, uncompromising precision that left absolutely no room for interpretation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the teacup rattling faintly against his saucer. The psychological ambush had completely collapsed against the ironclad fortress of my intellect. He threw a desperate, panicked glance at Blake. The rapid-fire tactics had failed to produce a single stutter, memory lapse, or moment of confusion. My mind was a steel trap, and I was effortlessly demonstrating that I retained absolute mastery over my faculties, my memory, and my business. Blake recognized the sheer futility of the situation immediately. His charming, concerned son-in-law persona rigidified into a mask of barely concealed fury. He abruptly placed his half-full teacup on the table and stood up, announcing that they needed to leave to accommodate Mr. Blackwood's demanding schedule. The disgraced psychiatrist practically leaped off the sofa, clutching his battered briefcase to his chest like a shield. I walked them to the front door, thanking them once again for their visit and assuring Blake that my energy levels had never been better. I closed the heavy oak door behind them and immediately moved to the front bay window, pulling the sheer curtain back just enough to observe their retreat. The moment Blake reached the driveway, his polished exterior completely disintegrated. I watched him hurl a stream of vicious insults at Blackwood before violently punching the leather steering wheel of his silver sports car. The impact shook the vehicle. His chest heaved with panic and rage. His timeline was expiring. His loan sharks were circling, and his shortcut to my wealth had just been sealed shut. I watched him pull his cell phone from his pocket and aggressively dial a number. He pressed the phone to his ear, his face contorting into an expression of frantic, manufactured distress. Less than 60 seconds later, my own phone began to ring from its place on the glass coffee table. I walked back into the sitting room and picked it up. The caller ID displayed my daughter's name. I answered the call, and Morgan's voice immediately pierced the speaker. She was absolutely hysterical. She was sobbing so heavily she could barely form a coherent sentence. She begged me to sit down, asking repeatedly if I knew where I was and if I was feeling frightened. I asked her calmly what was wrong. Her voice trembled violently as she explained that Blake had just called her in a state of absolute terror. He had spun a completely fabricated, devastating story. Blake told my daughter that he had stopped by the house to check on me, only to find me wandering the hallways in a total daze. He claimed I did not recognize him, that I had acted aggressively toward his wellness coach, and that I had looked him directly in the eye and forgotten my own name. The psychological warfare had officially escalated. Blake could not prove I was incompetent, so he decided to simply convince my daughter that my mind was already gone. Less than 20 minutes after that frantic phone call, headlights swept violently across my manicured front lawn. Tires screeched against the pavement as Morgan's car jerked to a halt in the driveway. The heavy oak front door flew open before I could even reach the foyer. Morgan rushed into the house, her hospital scrub still on her face, stained with fresh tears, and her chest heaving with panic. She was clutching a thick, freshly printed stack of legal papers against her chest like a physical shield. I stood in the center of the living room, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, watching my brilliant, highly educated daughter unravel completely. Blake had done his job with terrifying psychological efficiency. He had successfully convinced her that my mind was fracturing, and he had simultaneously convinced her that my signature was the only thing standing between their future and absolute ruin. She crossed the room and practically collapsed onto the velvet sofa, dropping the thick folder onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. Morgan looked up at me with red, pleading eyes. She began to speak in a rapid, trembling voice, confessing financial secrets she had clearly sworn to keep. She told me Blake's revolutionary tech startup was entirely stalled. She framed it exactly the way Blake had instructed her, to calling it a minor temporary tax hurdle that was unjustly freezing his venture capital. She wept openly, explaining that the immense financial pressure was destroying Blake, tearing their relationship apart before they even reached the altar. According to her manufactured reality signing, this family trust protection plan was the only way to release a massive bridge loan and save the man she loved. She reached out with shaking hands and pushed the document toward me. She begged me to sign it. She pleaded with me to trust her judgment, completely unaware that she was handing me the instrument of my own financial execution. I looked down at the freshly printed pages. It was the exact same irrevocable transfer of ownership Blake had tried to force on me at the steakhouse. He had simply used Morgan as his delivery mechanism, wrapping his hostile corporate takeover in my daughter's genuine tears. I stood perfectly still, looking at my only child weeping over a man who viewed her as nothing more than a master key to a bank vault. Every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to tell her the unvarnished truth. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders, play the horrific audio recording from the engagement party, and expose the fake psychiatrist Blake had paraded into my home just hours ago. But I forced my jaw shut. I looked at the absolute desperation etched into her features and recognized the bitter reality of the situation. Morgan was entirely brainwashed by Blake's charming illusions. If I presented her with the brutal truth right now, her mind would immediately reject it to protect her fragile reality. She would accuse me of paranoia, attribute my claims to the exact dementia Blake was trying to pin on me, and double down on her loyalty to him. She had to hit rock bottom. She had to see Blake's mask slip with her own eyes when he realized he had been defeated. It was the most agonizing decision a father could make, but I had to let my daughter walk directly into the fire so she could finally see the flames. I stepped forward and picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the folder. Morgan let out a fractured gasp of profound relief. I flipped directly to the final signature page. I did not hesitate, but my mind snapped back to the brutal early days of building my real estate empire. 30 years ago, when I was purchasing rundown commercial properties in hostile, unregulated neighborhoods, physical threats and coercion were common business tactics. I had sat in the office of my very first bank manager and established a strict, immutable security protocol. I registered a specific legally binding signature for all my standard transactions, and I registered a secondary, highly specific variation of that signature strictly for situations of duress. The duress signature looked incredibly similar to my genuine autograph to the untrained eye, but it contained deliberate structural flaws. Any document bearing that specific variation was instantly rendered legally void, and it automatically flagged the transaction for federal fraud review the second it entered the banking system. I pressed the nib of the pen against the thick paper. I fluidly executed the duress signature, adding the distinct incorrect loop on the final letter of my last name. I signed every required line with absolute steady confidence. I was not signing away my legacy. I was signing Blake Kensington's federal arrest warrant. The second the ink dried on the final page, Morgan shot up from the sofa and threw her arms around my neck. She hugged me with a desperate, overwhelming force, burying her face in my shoulder. She thanked me repeatedly, her voice thick with overwhelming gratitude, telling me I had just saved her life and secured her future. She pulled away, wiping her tear-stained cheeks, and offered me a beautiful, fragile smile. She quickly gathered the signed documents, securing them tightly inside the leather folder as if they were made of solid gold. She promised to call me first thing in the morning to check on my health, completely believing that she had just completed a noble protective act for our family. She had no idea she was acting as a courier for a massive corporate fraud. I walked her to the front door and watched her rush down the porch steps. She climbed into her car, tossed the folder onto the passenger seat, and sped out of the driveway. I stood on the porch, feeling the cool night air against my face. The red glow of her taillights faded into the distance as she raced into the city to deliver the ultimate prize to her waiting fiancé. Blake would look at those signatures and believe he had finally won. He would believe he had successfully conquered the old workhorse and claimed the Atlanta skyline for himself. He had absolutely no idea that the ink on those pages was entirely worthless. He was about to march into the bank tomorrow morning carrying a ticking time bomb, and the resulting legal explosion would destroy everything he had ever built. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating blanket of humidity over Atlanta. I drove Morgan to the Kensington estate in Buckhead. The property was a sprawling faux European mansion that projected generations of old money. I knew from Jonathan Pierce's thorough financial background check that the Kensingtons leased the property month to month, barely keeping up with the exorbitant payments to maintain their high society facade. I kept that specific piece of financial leverage locked behind a polite smile as we walked through the towering front doors. A string quartet played in the corner of the grand foyer. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. Charles and Patricia Kensington stood at the center of the room holding court with a group of local venture capitalists and prominent angel investors. Patricia spotted us and immediately intercepted Morgan, pulling her into a tight theatrical embrace while completely ignoring my presence. Charles sauntered over a moment later holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon. He offered me a limp, dismissive handshake. He did not introduce me to the wealthy investors standing just a few feet away. Instead, he signaled a waiter and loudly instructed the young man to show me to a small secondary table near the kitchen doors, citing the need for me to have a quiet place away from the overwhelming noise. Morgan was already being ushered into the main dining room by Patricia, completely missing the blatant, calculated insult. I followed the waiter without a single word of protest. I took my seat at the isolated table, surrounded by the constant clatter of dishes and swinging doors. I watched the room from the shadows. Blake moved through the crowd, shaking hands and projecting the image of a tech visionary who had just secured his financial empire. He caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass in a silent, arrogant toast. He firmly believed the document sitting in his briefcase gave him total dominion over my life. I raised my water glass in return, playing the role of the defeated, marginalized old man to absolute perfection. I observed their desperate need to project wealth they did not possess. Every rented chandelier and leased luxury car parked outside was a testament to their impending ruin. The humiliation was temporary. The impending destruction I had orchestrated was permanent. After the main dinner service concluded, Charles approached my isolated table. He clapped a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, guiding me forcefully away from the crowd and into his private study. The room smelled of old leather and expensive polish, an elaborate stage set designed to intimidate guests. He closed the heavy oak doors, shutting out the string quartet and the laughter of his high society friends. Charles walked over to a humidor resting on his desk and pulled out 2 thick Cuban cigars. He handed one to me with a condescending smirk, tossing a silver cutter across the mahogany surface. He poured 2 glasses of scotch and settled into a high-backed leather armchair, looking at me with the smug satisfaction of a conqueror. Charles leaned forward and dropped all pretenses of polite society. He told me that Blake had secured the final signature on the family trust documents earlier that morning. He praised Morgan's cooperative nature, calling her a sensible girl who finally understood how the real world operated and who to trust with her future. Charles took a long drag of his cigar and let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. He then casually suggested that I use this transition period to start researching luxury assisted living facilities. He rattled off the names of several exclusive retirement homes in Florida, stating that a man of my advanced age and declining cognitive health should not be burdened with the brutal stress of property management. The implication was crystal clear and delivered with absolute staggering arrogance. Charles was explicitly informing me that the Kensington family was now entirely in charge of the Rollins wealth. He believed my daughter was under their complete control and my assets were safely locked in their vault. He smiled a cold reptilian expression and assured me they would provide a modest monthly stipend to cover my basic medical care. He spoke to me as if I were a ward of the state, a helpless dependent relying entirely on his newfound charity. I held the unlit cigar in my hand, studying the intricate gold band wrapped around the tobacco. I did not throw the scotch in his face. I did not inform him that his son was drowning in illicit debt, or that the signature he coveted was a legally void forgery. I simply listened to every insulting word, cataloging his overwhelming arrogance. I reached across the mahogany desk, picked up the heavy silver lighter, and calmly lit my cigar. I took a slow, deliberate puff, letting the rich smoke fill the quiet study. I looked Charles directly in the eyes and offered him a warm, deeply appreciative smile. I told him he was absolutely right. I agreed that the younger generation must step up and finally face the crushing weight of their true financial responsibilities. I stated that it was time for Blake to experience exactly what it takes to manage a massive portfolio in the unforgiving light of the real world. Charles beamed, entirely mistaking my calculated warning for utter submission and defeat. He raised his glass in a victorious toast, celebrating the seamless theft of my life's work. I stood up from the leather chair, leaving my untouched scotch on the desk. I informed Charles that the late hour was catching up to me and that I needed to return home to rest my tired mind. He did not offer to walk me out. He simply waved his hand dismissively, already turning his attention back to the opulent party waiting outside. I navigated my way through the crowded mansion, bypassing the laughing investors and the clinking champagne flutes. I stepped out the heavy front doors and into the humid, quiet sanctuary of the sprawling driveway. As my shoes hit the cobblestone pavement, my phone vibrated sharply inside my breast pocket. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a secure text message from Jonathan Pierce. The message contained a single definitive sentence. The blind trust had officially cleared the state registry system without a single bureaucratic delay. The invisible wall was fully erected and locked permanently into place. Every single commercial building, every bank account, and every acre of land I had acquired over the last 4 decades was now entirely legally disconnected from my name. My assets were officially ghosts. Blake was currently sitting inside that leased mansion, celebrating a multi-million-dollar victory with a forged document that laid claim to absolutely nothing. He had leveraged his entire future and his physical safety with the loan sharks on a collateral foundation that no longer existed in the eyes of the law. I slid the phone back into my pocket, walked to my car, and drove away from the Kensington estate. The weekend would pass in blissful ignorance. Monday morning would bring the absolute destruction of their entire world. At precisely 9 o'clock on Monday morning, Blake Kensington strode through the polished glass doors of the most exclusive corporate bank branch in downtown Atlanta. I knew every intricate detail of this encounter because the senior branch manager, a man whose career I had personally mentored 2 decades ago, called me immediately afterward to report the spectacular failure. Blake approached the mahogany desk with the supreme, unchecked arrogance of a man who believed he had already won the war. He tossed the heavy leather folder onto the pristine surface, demanding the immediate authorization of a $3 million commercial bridge loan. He leaned back in the plush client chair, straightening his imported silk tie, entirely ready to watch the funds wire directly into his fraudulent startup accounts. The branch manager opened the folder and meticulously scanned the pages. He reviewed the irrevocable transfer of ownership Morgan had tearfully delivered the night before. The manager then typed my name into the bank's secure federal database. The system immediately flagged the paperwork with a harsh, glaring red warning on his monitor. The manager slid the documents back across the desk, looking at Blake with absolute professional ice. He informed my future son-in-law that the transaction was entirely impossible for 2 distinct fatal reasons. First, the signature on the final page was flagged by their security protocol as an invalid duress signature, rendering the entire contract legally void. Blake tried to argue, his voice rising in indignation, claiming it was merely the sloppy handwriting of a declining old man. The manager cut him off effortlessly and delivered the final crushing blow. Even if the signature had been pristine, the collateral listed in the contract was entirely inaccessible. The flagship commercial building Blake intended to leverage against the $3 million loan no longer belonged to Tyrone Rollins. It was currently registered to a secure anonymous corporate entity within a locked blind trust. The manager politely asked Blake to leave the premises before he was forced to alert the federal authorities to an attempted banking fraud. Blake was left staring at the rejected papers, the foundation of his entire criminal scheme evaporating into thin air. Blake stumbled out of the air-conditioned bank and onto the sweltering Atlanta pavement. The polished high society facade he had so carefully maintained over the weekend shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stood on the sidewalk, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs as the sheer magnitude of his failure crashed down upon him. He had leased a multi-million-dollar lifestyle, hosted lavish engagement parties, and promised his criminal investors a massive return based solely on the illusion that he was about to conquer my real estate empire. Now he possessed nothing but a worthless stack of forged paper. Before he could even process the reality of the blind trust, his cell phone vibrated violently inside his tailored suit pocket. He stared at the screen, his face draining of all remaining color. It was the underground loan sharks who had originally funded his sham tech startup. They were men who did not operate with legal contracts or polite negotiations. They operated with brutal, uncompromising violence. Blake answered the call with a trembling voice. The men on the other end of the line did not care about invalid signatures or complex corporate trusts. They gave him a final lethal ultimatum. Blake had a highly publicized, incredibly expensive tech launch gala scheduled for Thursday evening. It was supposed to be his triumphant debut into the Atlanta business elite. The loan sharks informed him that they would be attending that gala. If Blake did not transfer the full $3 million plus their exorbitant underground interest fees, By the time the event concluded, they would make a very public, very bloody spectacle out of him. They promised to dismantle his life in front of his wealthy friends and his future wife. Blake lowered the phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device onto the concrete. He was officially a dead man walking. The walls of his elaborate scam were closing in rapidly, threatening to crush him completely. The panic radiating through his body was absolute. He had no backup plan, no secondary investors, and no legitimate capital to his name. He was entirely trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the clock was ticking down to his destruction. In the grip of pure, unadulterated terror, Blake's narcissistic mind desperately scrambled for a lifeline. He fundamentally refused to accept that I had outplayed him. His ego simply could not process the fact that the supposedly senile old man he viewed with such contempt had orchestrated a flawless, devastating counterattack. Instead, his desperate brain manufactured a new, highly convenient reality. He convinced himself that the duress signature was merely a genuine mistake caused by my failing motor skills. He rationalized that the blind trust was simply an archaic, forgotten tax shelter that Morgan knew nothing about. He decided that all he needed to do was force me to sign a new, aggressively updated set of documents that explicitly dissolved the trust and authorized the immediate transfer of funds. He believed that if he could just get me alone in a room, he could intimidate, manipulate, or outright force me into compliance. Blake practically sprinted toward his parked silver sports car. He tore out of the downtown parking garage, his tires screaming against the concrete. He threw away every last ounce of the charming, patient son-in-law routine. Subtlety was a luxury he could no longer afford. He was a dangerous, cornered animal operating purely on adrenaline and the primal fear of the men coming to collect his debts. He merged onto the highway, pressing the accelerator to the floor, weaving recklessly through the morning traffic. He was heading straight for my estate in Buckhead. He planned to bypass Morgan entirely and confront me directly in my own home. He brought a fresh stack of legal papers, a heavy pen, and a singular violent determination to secure my wealth by any means necessary. I was sitting in my private study, calmly sipping a cup of black coffee and reviewing the morning market reports when the alert chimed on my security tablet. My perimeter cameras showed Blake's car tearing up my long driveway at a dangerous speed. The final confrontation had arrived exactly on schedule. I placed my coffee mug on the desk, straightened my posture, and waited for the doorbell to ring, entirely prepared to finish the war he had started. I sat in the dim light of my study, the heavy mahogany desk grounding me as the screech of tires tore through the quiet estate. A car door slammed with the force of a gunshot. Heavy, erratic footsteps pounded up the brick steps of my porch. I did not move. I heard the distinct metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock. It was the emergency spare I had given Morgan 5 years ago when she first moved into her own apartment, a key she had foolishly handed over to a man she believed was her future husband. The heavy oak door burst open, slamming against the interior wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Blake Kensington stormed into my foyer. The meticulously crafted mask of the visionary tech entrepreneur had entirely vaporized. In its place stood a cornered, desperate animal, drowning in the terrifying reality of his own actions. He moved with violent, uncoordinated energy. He kicked a delicate antique side table out of his way, sending a porcelain vase shattering across the hardwood floor. He grabbed one of the heavy dining chairs and hurled it against the wall, the wood splintering loudly in the echoing space. He screamed my name, his voice raw and cracking with panic. He demanded I show myself, screaming that I had made a catastrophic mistake at the bank, and that he needed a new signature immediately. He sounded less like an arrogant conqueror, and more like a terrified child who owed millions to violent predators. I listened to his rampage from the absolute silence of my study. I poured 2 fingers of aged bourbon into a crystal glass, the amber liquid catching the faint light from the hallway. I took a slow, measured sip, savoring the burn against the back of my throat. I waited until his frantic footsteps approached the double doors of my sanctuary. I did not hide. I simply sat in my high-backed leather armchair waiting for the hurricane to breach the room. The doors flew open, revealing Blake panting heavily. His designer suit rumpled his hair wildly out of place and his eyes wide with a dangerous, unstable frenzy. He had fresh legal documents crushed in his fist. He crossed the threshold, raising the crumpled papers like a weapon ready to unleash a barrage of threats. I did not flinch. I took another slow sip of my bourbon and gestured casually toward the upper corners of the room. I advised him to carefully consider his next physical movement. I pointed to the small, newly installed high-definition security lenses mounted discreetly near the crown molding. I kept my voice entirely conversational, devoid of any anger or fear. I informed my future son-in-law that those cameras were not standard home security. They were part of a closed-loop encrypted surveillance matrix I had activated the moment he sped through my front gates. The video and audio feeds were currently broadcasting live directly to the secure servers at Jonathan Pierce's law firm downtown. I clarified that a dedicated team of legal associates and private security contractors were watching his every move in real time. Blake froze his breath, hitching in his chest. His eyes darted frantically up to the blinking red recording lights. I explained that if he took one more aggressive step toward my desk, if he raised his voice to threaten me again, or if he attempted to force a pen into my hand, he would be committing felony assault and home invasion on a live federal broadcast. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The volatile, violent energy drained out of his posture, replaced by a sudden paralyzing fear. He lowered the crumpled documents, his hands shaking violently. He stammered, trying to formulate a coherent sentence, attempting to switch back to his manipulative charm, but the words failed him. He was trapped in a room with a man he had entirely underestimated, broadcasted to the very legal authorities he desperately needed to avoid. I swirled the bourbon in my glass, watching the terror solidify in his eyes. I told him he had walked into my home expecting to find a senile, defeated old man. Instead, he had walked directly into a legally impenetrable cage. I owned the room, I owned the footage, and I owned his future. He was completely paralyzed, caught between the loan sharks waiting for their money and the digital witnesses recording his every crime. The heavy silence in the study was suddenly shattered by the piercing wail of approaching police sirens. The sound cut through the humid Atlanta air, growing rapidly louder as multiple patrol cars sped up my driveway. Pierce's security team had done exactly as instructed, dispatching law enforcement the moment Blake had violently breached my front door. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the walls of my study, casting erratic shadows across Blake's terrified face. He stumbled backward, realizing he was about to be arrested for breaking and entering. Two armed officers rushed through the shattered front entrance, their heavy boots echoing down the hallway as they approached the open study doors. They stepped into the room, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, assessing the tension. I remained perfectly seated in my leather armchair. I did not shout or demand Blake be taken away in handcuffs. Instead, I offered the officers a warm, entirely calm smile. I raised my glass of bourbon slightly in a gesture of polite dismissal. I informed the officers in a smooth, steady voice that there was no emergency. I explained that my future son-in-law was simply experiencing a tremendously stressful week at his technology startup and had let a bit of temporary frustration get the better of him. I explicitly stated that he was a welcomed guest in my home and that absolutely no charges would be filed. The officers exchanged a confused glance, verified that I was unharmed, and slowly backed out of the room, returning to their cruisers. I watched Blake as the sirens faded down the street. The psychological impact of my mercy was infinitely more devastating than an arrest. I had just demonstrated absolute terrifying control over his fate. I had the power to send him to prison, and I chose to let him stay in his own personal hell. I wanted him to face the loan sharks on his own. This display of total dominance broke his mind completely. His shoulders slumped and a hollow, vacant look overtook his eyes. He realized he could not intimidate me, he could not trick me, and he could not legally touch a single cent of my wealth. Out of sheer blinding desperation, Blake turned on his heel and staggered out of the room. He had exactly one option left. He was going to bypass my consent entirely and file the fraudulent emergency medical guardianship order. Tuesday morning broke with a heavy oppressive heat mirroring the desperate legal assault Blake Kensington was actively launching downtown. Driven to the absolute brink of ruin by the invisible wall of my blind trust, Blake executed the dirtiest, most volatile strategy in his arsenal. He did not go to the courthouse alone. He arrived flanked by Charles and Patricia Kensington, presenting a united, deeply concerned family front to the presiding family court judge. They filed a draconian emergency ex parte injunction, a legal maneuver specifically designed to bypass standard notification procedures under the guise of an immediate life-threatening crisis. To secure this extreme measure, Blake submitted the fabricated medical dossier purchased from Simon Blackwood. The document was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It utilized dense psychiatric jargon to falsely diagnose me with rapidly accelerating violent dementia. Blackwood had boldly forged his signature, claiming I suffered from severe paranoia, spatial disorientation, and sudden aggressive outbursts that posed an imminent danger to myself and the general public. Blake stood before the judge and delivered a tearful, perfectly rehearsed plea. He claimed I was actively destroying my own estate in a state of unhinged delirium, and that immediate intervention was required to prevent me from liquidating my life savings. Because the court prioritizes the physical safety of senior citizens above all else, the judge took the forged medical seal at face value. With a single stroke of a pen, the judge granted the temporary emergency injunction. The legal order immediately struck the banking network, aggressively targeting my public financial footprint. Because my vast real estate portfolio and primary wealth were already shielded within the impenetrable blind trust, the court could not touch my actual empire. However, the injunction successfully slammed into my visible day-to-day retail checking accounts. The system immediately locked down my debit cards, froze my standard operating cash, and placed a hard hold on my personal banking profile. Blake believed he had just severed my financial lifelines, entirely unaware that he had merely scratched the paint on a heavily armored tank. I discovered the temporary asset freeze during the most mundane activity possible. I was standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a premium gas station in Buckhead, filling the tank of my car. I finished pumping the fuel, walked inside the convenience store, and slid my platinum debit card into the reader to pay for the transaction. The machine beeped a sharp, discordant tone, and the screen flashed a stark red message indicating the card had been declined. I retrieved a secondary credit card from my wallet and swiped it. The machine rejected it instantly. A cold, familiar resolve hardened in my chest. I knew exactly what that digital rejection meant. Blake had pulled the trigger. Before the young cashier could even offer a sympathetic apology, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against my thigh. I pulled the device out and saw Morgan's name illuminating the screen. I answered the call, and my daughter's voice immediately flooded the speaker. She was sobbing hysterically, her breathing erratic and panicked. She had just received the official court notification regarding the emergency guardianship injunction. Blake had manipulated the narrative with lethal precision. He had convinced Morgan that the court itself had mandated the medical review, framing the injunction as a tragic but absolutely necessary legal intervention to save my life. Morgan wept uncontrollably, begging me to listen to reason. She repeated Blackwood's fabricated diagnosis, verbatim, crying that my mind was failing and that I was no longer safe living alone in the estate. She pleaded with me to surrender my car keys and voluntarily check into the exclusive high-security memory care facility Blake had graciously selected for my rehabilitation. Listening to my only child tearfully beg me to institutionalize myself was a unique, agonizing form of torture. Blake had weaponized her genuine love and twisted it into a chain to bind me. I kept my voice entirely steady, refusing to display a single ounce of the anger boiling in my veins. I spoke to her with absolute clarity, projecting calm authority. I told her I loved her deeply, but I firmly declined the facility. I ended the call while she was still crying, knowing that her temporary heartbreak was the necessary price for her ultimate liberation. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it on the counter to cover the fuel. I did not drive back to my estate. I steered my vehicle directly toward the financial district, navigating the morning traffic with absolute chilling focus. I bypassed the receptionist at Jonathan Pierce's law firm and walked straight into his private corner office. Pierce was already standing behind his desk, holding a freshly printed copy of the emergency injunction Blake had filed hours earlier. He looked at me, a predatory smile spreading across his sharp features. The trap we had anticipated had finally been sprung. Pierce tossed Blackwood's forged medical certificate onto the table, pointing out the sloppy, easily disprovable lies scattered throughout the psychiatric evaluation. We did not waste a single minute on defensive posturing. I instructed Pierce to annihilate the injunction entirely. Pierce immediately drafted a devastating nuclear motion to dismiss. He attached the 3 pristine, independently verified neurological evaluations I had secured from the state's top medical professionals just days prior. These legally bulletproof documents proved with absolute scientific certainty that my cognitive function was flawless. Pierce did not simply submit the paperwork to the clerk for standard review. He leveraged the severe criminal implications of Blake's filing. He attached a formal notice of intent to pursue charges for perjury, medical fraud, and malicious prosecution. Pierce marched directly to the presiding judge's chambers and demanded an emergency flash hearing to contest the fraudulent injunction. The sheer weight of our counter-evidence forced the court's hand. The judge granted the request immediately, scheduling the mandatory flash hearing for 9 o'clock the very next morning. I stood in Pierce's office staring out at the towering glass buildings of the Atlanta skyline. Blake Kensington thought he had cleverly backed me into a corner. He believed he had successfully stripped away my resources and isolated me from my daughter. He had absolutely no idea that tomorrow morning he was going to walk into a federal courtroom and step directly onto a legal landmine. Wednesday morning arrived with a suffocating gray overcast that perfectly matched the sterile, heavy atmosphere of the county courthouse. I walked into the private judicial chambers alongside Jonathan Pierce, moving with the measured, steady stride of a man who held every single winning card. The room was aggressively illuminated by harsh overhead lights casting sharp shadows against the dark mahogany paneling. Blake Kensington sat at the plaintiff's table flanked by his parents Charles and Patricia. They wore matching expressions of smug, unshakable confidence, projecting the entitled arrogance of a family entirely accustomed to taking whatever they desired without consequence. Charles leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his expensive silk tie, shooting me a look of pure condescending victory. Patricia offered a tight, venomous smile, fully believing they were merely moments away from legally dismantling my life and seizing my empire. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. I took my seat beside Pierce, keeping my posture completely upright and my facial expression entirely unreadable. I was a stone fortress immune to their psychological games. Behind them, seated in the small observer's gallery, was Morgan. My daughter looked utterly shattered. She was clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield, her shoulders trembling visibly beneath her tailored jacket. The manufactured stress of the past 72 hours had drained all the color from her face. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, torn between the terrifying medical lies Blake had fed her and the impending destruction of her family. I felt a sharp pang of paternal instinct urging me to comfort her, but I ruthlessly suppressed it. She needed to witness this execution. She needed to see the monster hiding beneath her fiancé's charming exterior. The heavy wooden door at the back of the chamber swung open, and the presiding family court judge took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a stern, uncompromising man with decades of experience handling brutal domestic disputes. He slammed his gavel down, instantly silencing the quiet murmur of the room. He announced that this emergency flash hearing was convened to address the severe, unprecedented allegations regarding my mental competence and the immediate control of my financial estate. Blake sat forward, an eager, predatory glint in his eye. He honestly believed he was about to be handed the keys to my kingdom. Blake's aggressively compensated attorney stood up immediately, launching into a deeply rehearsed, highly theatrical opening statement. He painted a tragic, horrifying picture of my cognitive decline. He claimed I was a danger to myself and the public, violently unraveling and destroying my own financial legacy in a state of paranoid delirium. To cement this malicious fabrication, the lawyer produced the medical certificate forged by Simon Blackwood. He slid the document across the judge's bench with a dramatic flourish, declaring it was undeniable clinical proof of my severe dementia. He formally requested that Blake be granted immediate, absolute conservatorship over my life, my properties, and my remaining bank accounts. Blake nodded solemnly, playing the role of the devastated, deeply concerned son-in-law to absolute perfection. Charles and Patricia mirrored his fake grief, dabbing at dry eyes. Jonathan Pierce did not wait for the judge to review the fraudulent paperwork. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a chilling, predatory calm. Pierce informed the court that the plaintiff's entire case rested on a single, fundamentally corrupt piece of paper. He reached into his briefcase and extracted a massive, heavily tabbed legal dossier. Pierce walked directly to the bench and handed the explosive file to the judge. He stated in a voice that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet chamber that Dr. Simon Blackwood was not a licensed holistic wellness coach or a practicing psychiatrist. Pierce revealed that Blackwood had his state medical license permanently revoked exactly 3 years ago. The dossier contained the official medical board transcripts proving Blackwood had been indicted and disgraced for accepting illicit cash bribes to falsify prescriptions and manufacture fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. The arrogant smirk instantly melted off Blake's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Pierce was relentless. He did not stop at destroying Blackwood's credibility. He pulled out the 3 pristine, independently verified neurological evaluations I had secured on Monday morning. He submitted them to the judge, highlighting the signatures of the top 3 accredited neurologists in the entire state of Georgia. These legitimate, unassailable documents proved scientifically that my cognitive function was flawless. Pierce then presented the bank records verifying that Blake had wired substantial sums of money directly to Blackwood's offshore accounts just days prior to this hearing. Pierce systematically dismantled Blake's entire legal strategy, exposing it as a desperate, highly illegal conspiracy to commit elder fraud and steal my commercial real estate portfolio. The presiding judge flipped through the thick dossier Pierce had provided, reading the medical board indictments and the legitimate neurological evaluations. The air in the private chamber grew suffocatingly dense. Charles and Patricia Kensington sat frozen in their chairs, their high society posturing completely neutralized by the undeniable evidence of their son's criminal activity. The judge finally looked up, his face hardening into a mask of absolute judicial fury. He slammed the forged medical certificate onto his desk, glaring directly at Blake with profound disgust. He stated unequivocally that he possessed zero tolerance for individuals who weaponized the family court system to execute financial theft. The judge did not merely dismiss the emergency injunction, he verbally eviscerated Blake right in front of his parents and my daughter. He declared the plaintiff's filing to be a malicious, fraudulent attack entirely devoid of legal merit. He immediately lifted the temporary freeze on my personal checking accounts, fully restoring my financial autonomy. Furthermore, the judge issued a severe, uncompromising warning directly to Blake. He stated that he was officially forwarding Pierce's dossier to the district attorney's office for an immediate criminal review. He advised Blake to retain criminal defense counsel, as he would likely be facing felony charges for perjury, conspiracy, and submitting forged documents to a federal court. The swift, brutal stroke of the gavel echoed through the room as the judge officially adjourned the hearing, throwing the entire case out with extreme prejudice. Morgan covered her mouth with her hands, choking back a sob of pure shock as the reality of Blake's monstrosity finally penetrated her brainwashing. I stood up, adjusting my cuffs, feeling the absolute weight of victory. Charles and Patricia rushed out of the room, fleeing the humiliation as fast as their legs could carry them. Blake did not move. He remained glued to the plaintiff's table, his eyes locked blindly onto the polished hardwood floor. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His mind was violently calculating the catastrophic reality of his situation. He had no legal authority. He had no access to my millions. He had absolutely nothing. The terrifying truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. His highly publicized, incredibly expensive tech launch gala was scheduled to begin in less than 10 hours. The violent underground loan sharks who funded his entire fake lifestyle were expecting their $3 million tonight. Blake was entirely out of time, out of options, and completely alone. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the city as Wednesday evening arrived. The launch party for Blake's fictitious tech startup was held in a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse venue in the financial district. Every inch of the room screamed of least extravagance. Towering ice sculptures slowly melted onto silk tablecloths. Waiters in tailored uniforms circulated with silver trays of imported champagne and beluga caviar. It was a multi-million-dollar illusion built entirely on a foundation of illicit debt and suffocating panic. Blake stood near the entrance, his tailored tuxedo clinging to a frame that was visibly vibrating with adrenaline. The loan sharks had given him until the end of this very event to produce $3 million. He had absolutely nothing. Yet in a display of staggering delusional narcissism, he refused to cancel the gala. Instead, he doubled down on the deception. As I stepped off the private elevator, Blake immediately abandoned his conversation with a local venture capitalist and intercepted us. He gripped Morgan's arm with a bruising intensity, pulling her tight against his side. He then reached out and clamped a heavy hand onto my shoulder, forcefully dragging me into the center of the room. He needed me there. I was the ultimate prop. To the wealthy investors and high society sycophants filling the room, my presence signaled total endorsement. It implied that the Rollins real estate empire was backing his vaporware company. Blake flagged down a hired photographer, forcing a wide, manic smile onto his face. He demanded pictures of the three of us together, presenting the flawless image of a unified, wealthy family passing the generational torch. Morgan looked physically ill, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit, still entirely traumatized by the morning's courtroom revelations. She stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer sociopathy of the man standing beside her. I did not resist his physical manipulation. I simply turned toward the camera lens and offered a warm, dignified smile. I played the role of the supportive father-in-law to absolute perfection. I knew the men who held Blake's life in their hands were already somewhere in the building, and I wanted the official record to show that I was standing right beside him when his entire universe finally shattered. I detached myself from Blake's suffocating grip and moved toward the edge of the room, taking a position near a massive floor-to-ceiling window. I procured a crystal glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and settled into the shadows to observe the machinery of their desperation. Charles and Patricia Kensington were slithering through the crowd with practiced predatory grace. They were working the room with a frantic underlying urgency, cornering every high-net-worth individual and prominent angel investor they could find. They were actively attempting to raise emergency capital on the spot to save their son from the impending slaughter. To do this, they weaponized the very lie that had just gotten them eviscerated in federal court. Patricia leaned in close to the wife of a prominent banking executive wearing a mask of tragic manufactured grief. I watched her lips move, confirming the narrative. She whispered that I was tragically unwell, that my mind was rapidly deteriorating, and that Blake had officially stepped in to manage the vast Rollins estate. Charles echoed the exact same lie across the room, clapping investors on the back and assuring them that Blake was now the de facto king of my commercial empire. Several guests turned to look at me, their faces softening with polite, condescending pity. They saw an old man standing quietly in the corner, holding a glass of water, utterly oblivious to the modern business world passing him by. They believed the Kensingtons' narrative completely. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold carbonation burn the back of my throat. I did not intervene. I did not march over and correct their slanderous whispers. I simply let them dig their graves deeper into the bedrock. Every lie they spun to these powerful investors was another nail in their social and financial coffins. They were staking their entire remaining reputation on a falsehood that was scheduled to publicly detonate in less than an hour. I cataloged the face of every single investor who nodded along with Charles and Patricia, permanently committing their names to memory. The thumping bass of the ambient electronic music vibrated through the floorboards, drowning out the nervous chatter of the crowd. At the far end of the venue, an elevated platform housed the complex audiovisual equipment necessary for Blake's upcoming keynote presentation. Carmen, the senior event coordinator, stood behind the massive mixing board. I had known Carmen for years. She had successfully managed several of my corporate charity galas in the past, and she possessed a fierce, uncompromising loyalty to the people who treated her with respect. She was the one who had originally warned me about Blake's aggressive, unauthorized budget demands and the suspicious, dangerous men circling the venue's loading docks earlier that afternoon. She knew exactly what kind of man Blake Kensington was, and she despised him. Carmen adjusted the heavy headset over her ears, her fingers dancing across the illuminated sliders, ensuring the room's acoustics were perfectly balanced. She picked up a solid black clipboard, checked her watch, and stepped down from the platform. She moved efficiently through the dense crowd, projecting the aura of a busy professional, ensuring the timeline was strictly followed. She charted a path that brought her directly past my isolated position by the window. As she approached, she did not break her stride. She did not make direct eye contact or offer a polite greeting. She simply brushed her shoulder against my arm. In a swift, seamless transfer executed with absolute precision, she slid a small, heavy object from beneath her clipboard and pressed it directly into my open palm. My fingers closed around the cold, hard plastic. It was a compact, encrypted remote control synced directly to the master override channel of the venue's audiovisual system. Carmen continued walking, disappearing into the sea of tailored suits and evening gowns without leaving a single trace of our interaction. I slid my hand into my suit pocket, securing the device against my side. The trap was now fully armed and locked. The loan sharks were approaching the front doors. Blake was preparing to take the stage to deliver his final desperate pitch, and I held the detonator to his entire existence in the palm of my right hand. The overhead lights inside the sprawling penthouse dimmed to a dramatic deep azure as a solitary, brilliant spotlight snapped onto the center of the elevated stage. The ambient electronic music faded into a low, expectant hum that rippled through the floorboards. Blake adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo jacket and practically bounded up the carpeted stairs. He grabbed the microphone from its chrome stand with practiced theatrical ease. He projected a wide, blinding display of manufactured charisma, a smile carefully engineered to completely mask the lethal, suffocating panic gnawing at his insides. Beads of cold sweat began to form along his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning of the venue. He welcomed the dense crowd of prominent venture capitalists, skeptical angel investors, and influential high society elites. He thanked them profusely for attending the dawn of what he boldly called a new technological era. He did not speak about software architecture, actual product development, or realistic revenue projections. His company was entirely hollow and empty shell designed solely to capture their cash. Instead, he launched into a deeply rehearsed, emotionally manipulative sermon about the fundamental pillars of human success. He paced the stage like a polished evangelist, speaking passionately about family values, absolute integrity, and the sacred, unbreakable bond of intergenerational trust. He gestured expansively toward the darkened corners of the room, claiming that his revolutionary startup was not merely a lucrative business venture but a modern continuation of the Honorable Rollins family legacy. He dared to invoke my name directly to the crowd. He praised my decades of relentless hard work, claiming that my unwavering mentorship and deep financial wisdom were the absolute foundation of his new enterprise. He forced Morgan to stand near the front row, weaponizing her physical presence to validate his lies. He promised his wealthy investors that their capital would be managed with the exact same fiercely protective, honorable stewardship that had built my commercial real estate empire. He stood under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlight, aggressively peddling a narrative of absolute moral purity, while violent loan sharks waited quietly by the exit doors to collect a massive blood debt. He was entirely consumed by his own desperate performance, fiercely believing his golden tongue could somehow delay the impending slaughter and force his fraudulent reality into existence. I stood completely motionless in the shadows by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, observing the spectacle with cold, calculating detachment. My thumb rested firmly against the smooth plastic surface of the remote control Carmen had covertly slipped into my palm. I listened to Blake spin his sickening, hypocritical web of lies, waiting patiently for the precise, optimal moment of peak arrogance. He raised his free hand toward the glittering chandeliers, asking the captivated audience to raise their champagne flutes and toast to the future of ethical, transparent business. I pressed the central button on the remote with a single deliberate surge of pressure. A sharp, piercing electronic screech instantly ripped through the venue. Blake's microphone died immediately, cutting off his grand, triumphant toast in mid-sentence. He tapped the metal grill of the microphone with his index finger, his polished smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he shot a panicked, furious glare towards the empty audio-visual booth. He assumed it was a simple, easily corrected technical malfunction. He was fatally incorrect. The venue's massive state-of-the-art surround sound system suddenly surged to maximum volume, bypassing the mixing board entirely. A heavy burst of digital static washed over the startled crowd, immediately followed by crystal-clear, high-definition audio. It was a flawless, unfiltered recording captured directly from the hidden microphone I had placed inside his private study during his opulent engagement party. Blake's own voice suddenly boomed from every massive speaker mounted in the penthouse ceiling. The voice was stripped of all its polished public charm, dripping instead with a sneering, aggressive malice that chilled the room. The recorded voice laughed cruelly before delivering the fatal, undeniable strike. "The old workhorse is a clueless wallet. Once he signs this blank guarantee, I will dump him in a home and take the whole damn building." The pristine audio echoed relentlessly against the thick glass walls, vibrating heavily through the floorboards with staggering clarity. The recording continued without mercy, broadcasting his complete, unvarnished contempt to the silent room. The digital phantom of Blake Kensington openly bragged to his unseen accomplices about manipulating Morgan, forging vital medical documents, and illegally leveraging my entire life's work to cover his massive illicit debts. Investors exchanged bewildered, horrified glances as the crude words washed over them. He laid out his entire criminal blueprint with absolute staggering arrogance. He broadcasted his utter lack of morality to the exact people he was currently attempting to swindle out of millions. The juxtaposition was violently jarring. The physical Blake stood paralyzed under the bright white spotlight, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated horror, while his recorded voice gleefully confessed to severe elder abuse and blatant corporate fraud at a deafening volume. He dropped the dead microphone from his trembling hand. It hit the wooden stage with a heavy, hollow thud that was entirely swallowed by the overwhelming sound of his own recorded villainy, exposing him to the world. The damning recording concluded with a sharp, definitive click. The venue's powerful audio system immediately cut to absolute dead silence. The ambient electronic music did not return to mask the tension. The transition was so abrupt and violent that it seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the sprawling room. Dozens of waiters in crisp white jackets froze completely in place, their silver trays hovering motionless in the air. Hundreds of wealthy investors, bank executives, and high-profile socialites slowly lowered their crystal champagne flutes. Their expressions morphed rapidly from polite confusion to utter profound disgust. No one whispered a single word. No one shifted their weight. The silence that descended upon the penthouse was absolute and deafening, heavier than any physical object. It was the undeniable sound of a total, irreversible social and financial execution. The carefully constructed facade of the Kensington family completely disintegrated in real time. Charles and Patricia Kensington stood utterly frozen near the center ice sculpture, their faces drained of all blood, fully realizing they were now permanently tied to a spectacular public fraud. Their desperate networking efforts from mere minutes ago were now revealed as complicit actions in a massive criminal conspiracy. Blake remained trapped on the elevated stage, pinned ruthlessly under the unblinking spotlight like a dissecting specimen on a glass slide. He stared blankly at the polished floorboards, his chest heaving, entirely unable to lift his head to meet the horrified, condemning gaze of the crowd. He did not attempt to defend himself, and he did not try to invent a desperate excuse. His mind had completely snapped under the crushing reality of his absolute exposure. Every single lie he had told to secure funding was now public knowledge. From my isolated position in the shadows, I watched two heavily built men in dark, tailored suits detach themselves from the perimeter wall. They began walking slowly and deliberately toward the front of the stage, ignoring the frozen crowd. The loan shark deadline had officially arrived, and Blake Kensington had absolutely nothing left to offer them. Blake stumbled off the elevated platform, his polished leather shoes slipping on the polished floorboards. The deafening silence of the penthouse pressed against him, magnifying the sound of his frantic, uneven breathing. He did not look at the disgusted faces of the venture capitalists or the stunned expressions of the bank executives. His singular, desperate focus locked entirely onto Morgan. She stood near the front row, her face drained of blood, her eyes wide with a horrified realization. Blake lunged toward her, closing the distance with the chaotic, aggressive energy of a drowning man clawing for a raft. He reached out to grab her shoulders, but his hands were shaking so violently he barely grazed her silk dress. He launched into a rapid, incoherent stream of frantic denials. He screamed that the audio was a sophisticated deep fake, a malicious artificial intelligence fabrication engineered by jealous corporate rivals. He shouted that his competitors were actively trying to sabotage his launch and destroy his pristine reputation. His voice cracked, rising an octave into a shrill, hysterical pitch as he begged her to believe him. He claimed the entire recording was a criminal setup designed to tear their beautiful family apart. He waved his arms wildly, his tuxedo jacket riding up his perfect grooming, entirely destroyed by the cold sweat pouring down his face. He pleaded with her to ignore the overwhelming evidence echoing in her ears and trust the man she was supposed to marry. Every lie he spat out only amplified his guilt. He was a cornered predator trying to weave one final impossible illusion. The wealthy investors surrounding them watched the pathetic spectacle unfold, stepping back as if Blake were carrying a highly contagious disease. He was entirely isolated in his frantic, transparent deception. Morgan stood completely paralyzed, staring at the man she had loved, trusted, and blindly defended against her own father. Blake's frantic excuses washed over her, but the words no longer carried their hypnotic weight. The meticulously crafted spell he had woven around her mind shattered with brutal, absolute finality. The puzzle pieces of the past month slammed together in her brain with sickening clarity. She suddenly understood the aggressive rush to secure my signature on the trust documents. She recognized the terrifying speed at which he had procured that forged medical certificate. She saw the true monstrous intent behind his eager suggestion to lock me away in a high-security memory care facility. It had never been about my health or our family legacy. It had always been a calculated, predatory extraction of my wealth. A profound, icy resolve replaced the shock on her face. The trembling in her shoulders ceased completely. She did not cry. She did not argue with his pathetic lies about artificial intelligence and corporate sabotage. She simply stepped forward, closing the final inch between them, and drove the palm of her hand across Blake's cheek with devastating, bone-rattling force. The sharp crack of the slap echoed like a gunshot through the silent penthouse. Blake staggered backward, his head snapping to the side, a bright red mark instantly blooming across his pale skin. He raised a hand to his face, looking at her in genuine shock. Morgan did not give him a single second to recover. She grabbed the massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring gripping her left hand. She ripped the platinum band over her knuckle with a violent jerk, tearing the skin, and hurled the heavy stone directly into the center of his chest. The ring bounced off his tuxedo lapel and clattered uselessly onto the hardwood floor, spinning to a halt near his feet. She looked him directly in the eyes and told him he was a disgusting, pathetic fraud. She declared that she would rather die than spend another second standing in his presence. The absolute disgust in her voice stripped away the last remnants of his fake empire. Morgan turned her back on him, walking away with a rigid, unbreakable dignity that commanded the immediate respect of every single person watching the execution. Blake lunged forwards to grab Morgan's arm, a primal reflex of a controller losing his grip. Before his fingers could even graze her fabric, I stepped out of the shadows and planted myself firmly between them. I formed an impenetrable physical wall of immovable resolve. I looked down at the trembling, pathetic shell of the man who had tried to steal my life. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply informed him that if he ever attempted to touch my daughter or speak her name again, I would personally ensure he spent the rest of his miserable existence locked inside a federal penitentiary. My tone was absolute, carrying the heavy, lethal weight of a promise that was already half fulfilled. Blake shrank back, his bravado entirely crushed under the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He opened his mouth to formulate a response to utter one final desperate threat, but the words died in his throat. His attention was abruptly and violently redirected toward the heavy glass entrance doors at the rear of the penthouse. The dense crowd of wealthy socialites and venture capitalists parted like the Red Sea. 3 heavily built men in tailored dark suits were pushing through the throngs of people with aggressive, uncompromising purpose. They did not carry champagne flutes. They did not wear the polite networking smiles of the corporate elite. They moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of professional predators. These were the underground loan sharks who had bankrolled Blake's fraudulent tech empire. They had watched the entire spectacular public execution unfold from the back of the room. They had heard the undeniable recorded proof that Blake possessed absolutely zero assets, zero legal leverage, and zero capacity to repay the $3 million he had borrowed. The absolute deadline they had issued him earlier that morning had officially expired. The lead enforcer, a man with a scarred jawline and dead, unblinking eyes, stopped exactly 3 feet away from Blake. He did not shout. He did not make a theatrical scene. He simply looked at the ruined entrepreneur with a chilling clinical assessment. He stated that the launch party was officially over and that it was time for Blake to settle his accounts. Blake began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the true physical danger of his situation finally eclipsed his financial ruin. He looked toward his parents, but Charles and Patricia had already retreated toward the service elevators, completely abandoning their son to save their own shattered reputations. He looked at the surrounding investors, but they turned their backs in unison. Finally, his panicked eyes locked onto mine, silently begging for the very mercy he had aggressively tried to steal from me. I held his gaze for a long, deliberate moment, offering him nothing but a cold, final nod of farewell. I placed my hand gently on Morgan's shoulder, guiding my daughter toward the private exit, leaving Blake Kensington entirely alone to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of his greed. Section 1 cornered. The lead enforcer did not bother walking up the carpeted stairs of the elevated stage. He simply vaulted onto the platform, his heavy boots thudding against the hollow wood. Before Blake could even raise his hands in a defensive gesture, the man lunged forward. He grabbed the lapels of Blake's custom-tailored tuxedo, twisting the expensive fabric into a tight knot, and violently slammed him backward. Blake's spine collided heavily with the metal scaffolding of the audio-visual rigging. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. The remaining 2 enforcers flanked the stage, crossing their arms and blocking any possible route of escape. The wealthy investors standing in the front rows instinctively took several steps back, creating a wide, terrified perimeter. No one lifted a finger to intervene. Blake was entirely isolated in his nightmare. The enforcer leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried perfectly in the dead silence of the penthouse. He informed Blake that the generous extension had expired and that they would be leaving the building together to discuss the immediate repayment of the $3 million. Blake's polished arrogance dissolved into pure, unfiltered cowardice. He began to hyperventilate, his eyes wide and leaking tears of sheer panic. He grabbed the enforcer's thick wrists, begging frantically for 24 more hours. He promised he could liquidate assets, claiming he had secondary investors lined up and ready to wire the funds. The enforcer simply tightened his grip, cutting off Blake's air supply, completely unimpressed by the frantic lies. In a final, pathetic act of desperation, Blake looked over the enforcer's shoulder and spotted me standing near the exit doors with Morgan. He extended a trembling finger in my direction, screaming at the top of his lungs. He told the loan sharks that I was the source of the capital. He shouted that the Rollins estate was worth hundreds of millions of dollars and that I was legally obligated to cover his debts. He begged the violent men to take me instead, entirely willing to serve his future father-in-law to criminal predators to save his own skin. I paused with my hand resting on the brass handle of the exit door. I turned my head and locked eyes with the pathetic, sniveling fraud pinned against the metal scaffolding. I did not show anger. I did not display triumph. I offered him absolute chilling indifference. I slowly turned my back to him, shielding my daughter from his sight, and pushed the heavy glass doors open. I walked out of the venue, leaving Blake completely abandoned to his fate. Section 2. The Federal Raid. The enforcer sneered at Blake's cowardly attempt to deflect the debt. He yanked the ruined entrepreneur forward, preparing to drag him off the stage and force him into the private freight elevator. Before he could take a single step, a deafening crash echoed from the main entrance of the penthouse. The heavy oak double doors burst open with explosive coordinated force, slamming violently against the interior walls. This was not the venue's private security detail arriving to break up a scuffle. Dozens of agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stenciled with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC flooded into the grand reception hall. They moved with aggressive, practiced military precision, instantly fanning out across the room to secure every possible exit. Authoritative shouts commanded the terrified high society guests to step back and keep their hands visible. The sudden, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement paralyzed the entire room. The loan sharks recognized the catastrophic shift in power immediately. They were violent predators, but they were not foolish enough to engage federal agents in a crowded room. The lead enforcer instantly released his grip on Blake's tuxedo. He and his associates raised their hands in a gesture of passive compliance, backing away from the stage and seamlessly melting into the panicked crowd. They abandoned Blake without a second thought, severing their ties to a man who was now a massive federal liability. Blake collapsed onto his hands and knees on the wooden stage, gasping for air, staring in absolute shock at the swarm of federal badges advancing toward him. He believed this raid was a direct response to the audio recording I had just broadcasted. He was entirely incorrect. Jonathan Pierce did not simply build defensive legal walls. Pierce was a master of the counteroffensive. When Blake had arrogantly strutted into the corporate bank branch on Monday morning and submitted the forged medical certificates to secure his $3 million bridge loan, Pierce had already anticipated the move. Pierce had not merely flagged the transaction to freeze the assets. He had compiled a comprehensive, devastating legal dossier containing the forged signatures, the fake collateral contracts, and the digital wire requests. Pierce had forwarded that exact package directly to his contacts within the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. By submitting fraudulent documents to a federally insured institution, Blake had crossed the line from local elder abuse to massive federal bank fraud. The trap had been set days ago, and Blake had walked right into the jaws of the federal government. Section 3. The Arrest. 2 senior federal agents marched briskly up the carpeted steps of the stage, their eyes locked entirely on the broken man kneeling on the floorboards. Blake scrambled backward like a frightened crab, his leather shoes slipping uselessly against the polished wood. He held his hands up in front of his face, shaking his head frantically. He tried to invoke his fabricated authority, shouting that he was a legitimate chief executive officer and that this entire raid was a colossal misunderstanding orchestrated by jealous competitors. The agents ignored his pathetic rambling completely. The lead agent reached down, grabbed Blake by the shoulder of his ruined tuxedo, and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He spun Blake around with practiced efficiency and slammed him face first onto a nearby catering table. The violent impact sent crystal champagne flutes and silver serving trays crashing to the hardwood floor in a shower of shattered glass and expensive liquor. Blake grunted in pain, his cheek pressed hard against the damp silk tablecloth. The cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs snapped brutally around his wrists, locking his arms tightly behind his back. The lead agent leaned in close, reciting the Miranda rights in a booming, uncompromising voice that echoed off the high glass ceilings. He specifically and loudly cited the charges. Blake Kensington was being placed under federal arrest for wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, identity theft, and severe bank fraud. The words carried the absolute crushing weight of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Blake wrenched his head to the side, looking desperately out at the crowd. He expected the prominent venture capitalists and angel investors to protest to vouch for his character or to demand an explanation from the authorities. He found no salvation. The wealthy socialites and business elites simply stood back entirely devoid of sympathy. Instead of offering help, hundreds of glowing smartphone screens rose from the darkness of the venue. The guests were actively recording every single second of his physical and social destruction. Camera flashes strobed through the room, blinding him with brief bursts of harsh white light. The very people he had invited to witness his triumphant ascension were now happily documenting his absolute ruin. His reputation was dead. His freedom was gone. The grand illusion of Blake Kensington was permanently and digitally erased from the world. The two federal agents hauled Blake off the ruined catering table, his tailored tuxedo soaked in spilled champagne and dusted with shattered crystal. They marched him forcefully toward the glass elevators, parading him past the relentless barrage of smartphone cameras. The flashing lights illuminated the sheer terror paralyzing his face. As the elevator doors slid open to swallow the disgraced entrepreneur, a chaotic commotion erupted near the center of the penthouse. Charles and Patricia Kensington violently shoved their way through the ring of stunned investors. Their pristine high society composure had completely evaporated. Patricia had lost one of her designer heels in the scramble, and Charles's expensive silk tie was yanked entirely askew. They ignored the mocking whispers and the glaring camera lenses of their former peers. They rushed directly toward the private exit where I stood with Morgan. The immense, unshakable arrogance they had projected just an hour ago was entirely eradicated. They threw themselves onto the polished hardwood floor right at my feet. Charles grabbed the hem of my suit jacket, his knuckles white, his face contorted in absolute desperation. Patricia clamped her hands around my ankles, weeping hysterically, her expensive mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. They begged me to intervene. Charles choked out frantic, pathetic pleas, demanding I march over to the lead federal agent and declare the entire situation a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to tell the authorities that the $3 million loan was an authorized family transaction, a private business strategy that simply required some internal paperwork corrections. Patricia wailed loudly, claiming Blake was a good boy who simply got in over his head trying to impress me. She begged me to save my future son-in-law, swearing on her life that they would repay every single cent if I just made the federal charges disappear. They groveled in the spilled champagne, perfectly willing to sacrifice every ounce of their remaining dignity if it meant preserving their stolen wealth and keeping their son out of a federal penitentiary. They looked up at me with tear-soaked faces, entirely convinced that my inherent paternal instinct to protect Morgan from a public scandal would force me to shield their criminal family from the law. I looked down at the two sobbing figures clinging to my shoes. I felt absolutely zero empathy. I did not step back, and I did not offer them a single ounce of comfort. The entire room fell into a breathless hush, hundreds of wealthy elites straining to hear my response. I spoke with a lethal, resonant calm that carried perfectly across the vast penthouse. I told Charles to remove his hands from my jacket immediately. He recoiled as if I had burned him, shrinking back against the floorboards. I systematically dissected the pathetic, hollow illusion of the Kensington family right in front of their wealthy peers. I reminded them of the very first dinner we shared 3 years ago, detailing the thinly veiled racism they had directed at me. I recounted the condescending remarks they made about my upbringing in the South Side, their subtle mockery of my initial struggles, and their absolute certainty that my corporate empire was simply a stroke of blind, uneducated luck. They had looked down on me for decades, believing their generational wealth and exclusive country club memberships inherently elevated them above a man who actually built his fortune with his own two hands. I raised my voice, ensuring every investor in the room heard the absolute truth. I declared that their precious son was not a victim of circumstance or a stressed entrepreneur making a single bad decision. Blake was a direct product of their own moral bankruptcy. I exposed how they had actively enabled Blake's deception, happily spending the money he stole while willfully ignoring the trail of destroyed lives he left in his wake. They taught him to lie, they taught him to cheat, and they taught him that the rules did not apply to people born with the Kensington name. I called them exactly what they were. They were parasites who had raised a parasite. They had weaponized my daughter's love and attempted to steal my entire life's work to finance their unsustainable, fraudulent lifestyle. I told them that the universe was finally demanding payment for decades of their unmitigated greed, and I was absolutely thrilled to be the one collecting the debt. Patricia covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the brutal reality of my words stripped away her last remaining shreds of social armor. Charles stared at the floor, his entire body trembling, completely unable to dispute a single word of the verbal execution I had just delivered. They were entirely broken, exposed to the world as nothing more than pathetic, thieving frauds. While Charles and Patricia knelt weeping on the floorboards, the crowd parted one final time. Two senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission stepped forward, their expressions forged in professional stone. They did not carry handcuffs, but the heavy manila envelopes in their hands carried an equally devastating weight. The lead investigator looked down at the kneeling couple and sternly demanded they stand up and confirm their identities. Charles slowly climbed to his feet, his hands shaking violently as he helped his sobbing wife off the floor. The investigator did not offer a polite greeting or wait for an explanation. He extended his arm and slapped the thick envelopes directly against Charles's chest. He announced in a loud, unyielding voice that Charles and Patricia Kensington were officially being served with federal subpoenas. The investigator declared that the SEC had thoroughly reviewed the banking documents and routing numbers provided by Jonathan Pierce earlier that afternoon. Their personal signatures were plastered across multiple fraudulent shell companies Blake had used to launder the $3 million from the underground loan sharks. They were not simply innocent bystanders to their son's massive financial crime. They were legally documented and officially indicted co-conspirators who had actively profited from wire fraud. The investigator instructed them to surrender their passports immediately and secure criminal defense counsel, as they were now facing severe felony charges for money laundering and conspiracy to defraud a federal institution. Charles dropped the envelope. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling reams of damning financial evidence and offshore routing numbers across the polished wood. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as the true, inescapable magnitude of their destruction finally locked into place. They had lost their son, their fortune, their social standing, and their freedom in a single hour. I turned away from the wreckage of the Kensington family, placed my hand gently on Morgan's back, and escorted my daughter out of the penthouse. The morning sun aggressively pierced through the sheer curtains of Morgan's upscale townhouse, illuminating a space that had served as the staging ground for a massive, unprecedented deception. Morgan did not sleep a single minute. Instead, she spent the night systematically dismantling the physical footprint of Blake Kensington. She moved with a cold, ruthless, and terrifyingly calm efficiency. She dragged a heavy box of industrial black trash bags into the center of the master bedroom. She yanked open the walk-in closet doors and began tearing Blake's expensive designer suits directly off their wooden hangers. The Italian silk ties, the tailored cashmere sweaters, and the imported leather shoes were all unceremoniously shoved into the dark plastic. She did not fold a single item. She realized with sickening clarity that every single luxury garment in this closet had been purchased with fraudulent capital. They were the literal costumes of a con artist. She moved to the master bathroom, sweeping his high-end colognes, grooming kits, and electric razors directly into a bag with the back of her forearm. Glass bottles shattered against the floorboards, but she did not care to sweep up the mess. She collected his polished golf clubs, his monogrammed leather briefcase, and the expensive watches he had foolishly left behind on the nightstand. Every item was a monument to his staggering narcissism. She hauled the heavy, bulging trash bags down the carpeted stairs one by one. Her muscles burned with the physical exertion, but the intense labor felt incredibly purifying. It was a visceral physical exorcism of the parasite that had nearly consumed her life and destroyed her family. She dragged the bags out the front door and dumped them violently onto the concrete curb. The pristine image Blake had so carefully cultivated was now reduced to a pathetic pile of anonymous black garbage bags waiting for the municipal sanitation trucks. She stood on the sidewalk, breathing heavily in the crisp morning air, feeling an immense, profound weight finally lift from her shoulders. As Morgan stepped back inside the townhouse and locked the heavy deadbolt, her cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite kitchen counter. She glanced at the screen, noting the incoming call originated from a restricted government number. She pressed the answer button and engaged the speakerphone. An automated monotone voice announced an incoming collect call from the county detention center. Morgan did not speak. She simply tapped a secondary application on her screen, initiating a high-definition audio recording. Blake's voice suddenly crackled through the speaker. He was no longer the polished, arrogant tech visionary pitching to venture capitalists. He sounded incredibly small, utterly pathetic, and completely unhinged. He was sobbing loudly, his breathing ragged as he begged Morgan to accept the charges. He launched into a frantic, chaotic monologue of emotional manipulation. He swore that he loved her, claiming that his parents had forced him into the financial fraud and that he was entirely innocent of the wire fraud charges. He begged her to wire bail money, pleading with her to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney to get him out of the holding cell. He complained about the brutal conditions of the federal facility, attempting to weaponize their past relationship by using old pet names and trying to guilt her into submission. Morgan stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of absolute disgust. She did not argue with his transparent lies. She did not scream, and she did not demand an explanation for his treachery. She simply let him ramble, capturing every single pathetic, incriminating syllable on the digital recording. He was actively proving his complete lack of remorse. Once he paused to catch his breath, demanding to know if she was still there, Morgan silently terminated the connection. She immediately attached the audio file to a fresh email and sent it directly to Jonathan Pierce. She included a brief, unequivocal instruction. She ordered the attorney to use the recording to finalize a permanent ironclad restraining order against Blake Kensington and to immediately initiate the legal paperwork to annul the fraudulent engagement. She was permanently barricading her life against his existence. Morgan picked up her car keys and walked out the back door, leaving the empty, silent townhouse behind her. She drove across the city with a singular destination in mind, navigating the morning traffic with a renewed sense of absolute clarity. 30 minutes later, she pulled through the towering iron gates of my estate. She parked her car hastily in the circular driveway, leaving the engine running as she practically ran up the stone steps. I was waiting for her in the grand foyer, having anticipated her arrival since the moment we parted ways at the penthouse the previous night. The heavy oak doors swung open and Morgan stepped inside. The rigid defensive posture she had maintained throughout the morning completely shattered the instant she saw me. She crossed the marble floor and collapsed directly into my arms, bearing her face against my chest. Her knees gave out, and I held her tightly, absorbing the physical impact of her total emotional breakdown. She sobbed uncontrollably, the raw, unfiltered agony echoing through the cavernous hall. She clung to my jacket, her voice breaking as she delivered a desperate, profound apology. She apologized for her blinding naivety, for allowing a charismatic fraud to turn her against her own blood. She wept for dismissing my protective warnings, admitting that she had foolishly viewed my decades of hard-earned wisdom as outdated paranoia. She realized the staggering magnitude of my sacrifice. She understood that I had willingly endured her misplaced anger and public defiance simply to maneuver myself into a position to save her from absolute ruin. She apologized for taking my quiet, unwavering love for granted, acknowledging the brutal psychological burden I had carried to shield her from a monster. I did not offer empty platitudes or dismiss her apologies. I simply held my daughter, resting my chin against the top of her head, providing the silent, unyielding support she desperately needed. I told her that the deception was completely eradicated and that the foundation of our family was now entirely secure. The storm had finally passed, and we were standing together in the clear, uncompromising light of the truth. 6 months passed since the dramatic glass-shattering collapse inside the penthouse. The federal justice system moved with a crushing, methodical inevitability that completely dismantled Blake Kensington's remaining defenses. He did not put up a glorious cinematic legal fight. Cornered by the overwhelming audio recordings, the forged medical documents, and the irrefutable digitized trail of illicit wire transfers, his heavily compensated defense attorney advised immediate and unconditional surrender. Facing a mountain of federal felony charges that could easily have locked him away for the rest of his natural life, Blake accepted a comprehensive non-negotiable plea deal. The sentencing hearing was a brief, sterile affair held in a heavily fortified downtown federal courthouse. Morgan and I sat in the polished wooden gallery watching as the man who had nearly destroyed our family stood before a federal judge. Blake was entirely stripped of his tailored designer suits, his imported silk ties, and his manufactured arrogance. He was dressed in a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that highlighted his rapid physical deterioration. His face was pale, his posture slumped, and his hands were shackled securely to a thick leather waistbelt. The presiding judge read the verdict with zero hesitation and absolute judicial disgust. Blake was officially sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The charges of wire fraud conspiracy to commit elder abuse and federal document forgery were permanently etched into his record. He did not look back at us as the armed bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom. The arrogant tech visionary was gone, replaced by a broken convict shuffling toward a decade of absolute obscurity. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, signaling the definitive, irreversible end of his parasitic existence. I felt a profound, settling sense of closure wash over me. The monster had been completely neutralized, locked away in a concrete cell where his golden tongue, his fake charm, and his manipulative lies held absolutely zero currency. Beside me, Morgan watched him disappear without shedding a single tear. She simply exhaled a long, steady breath, permanently closing a dark chapter of her life. The man who had tried to mentally destroy her was now completely powerless. The collateral damage of Blake's spectacular downfall instantly consumed Charles and Patricia Kensington. The federal subpoenas handed to them on the night of the gala were merely the opening salvo in a brutal, uncompromising campaign of financial annihilation. The Securities and Exchange Commission ruthlessly audited their entire financial history, exposing a staggering multi-year web of tax evasion, fraudulent shell companies, and hidden liabilities. The Internal Revenue Service moved swiftly and without mercy, freezing their personal checking accounts and levying massive, catastrophic fines that entirely eclipsed their remaining liquid assets. Furthermore, the wealthy venture capitalists and bank executives who had been publicly humiliated at the launch party launched a relentless barrage of civil lawsuits. These highly aggressive legal actions pursued the Kensingtons for every single stolen dollar, draining their resources dry. Their grand, sprawling estate in the exclusive northern suburbs was exposed as a heavily leveraged lease they could no longer afford. Federal marshals officially seized the property, padlocking the wrought iron gates and methodically auctioning off their luxury vehicles, their imported art collections, and their antique furniture to satisfy the mounting legal judgments. The high society peers who had once attended their lavish dinner parties immediately severed all ties, treating the Kensington name like a highly contagious, toxic disease. With zero access to credit and their social capital entirely eradicated, Charles and Patricia were violently ejected from the world of extreme privilege they had so arrogantly claimed as their birthright. Stripped of their fake superiority, they were forced to relocate to a cramped, deteriorating low-income apartment complex on the very outskirts of the city's industrial district. It was the exact type of impoverished neighborhood they had spent their entire lives mocking and actively avoiding. I drove past the complex, once observing from the safety of my vehicle. I watched as Charles struggled to carry a cheap plastic grocery bag up a rusted, creaking metal staircase. Patricia stood on a cracked concrete balcony wearing faded clothes, staring blankly at a nearby chain-link fence. They were permanently trapped in a suffocating reality of their own, making condemned to live out their remaining years in absolute grinding poverty. They had raised a parasite, and now the host was entirely dead. On a quiet, sunlit Tuesday morning, I sat across from Jonathan Pierce in his private oak-paneled office. Morgan sat beside me, looking significantly healthier and more vibrant than she had in over a year. The dark shadows under her eyes were completely gone, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity and a renewed sense of purpose. Pierce adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and pushed a thick, heavily bound legal folio across the polished mahogany desk. He instructed Morgan to open it and carefully review the finalized declarations of the estate. She broke the official seal and slowly turned the crisp, heavy pages. Her eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, tracking the specific names, dates, and asset allocations of the vast Rollins commercial real estate portfolio. Suddenly, her hands stopped moving. Her breath hitched sharply in her throat as her eyes locked onto a single critical paragraph outlining the primary beneficiary status. She looked up at me, her hands trembling violently, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. The documents explicitly and undeniably proved that the entire multi-million-dollar empire was absolutely never in my name. I had legally, irreversibly transferred every single property, every trust fund, and every commercial holding directly to Morgan exactly 5 years ago. I was merely the appointed executor managing the daily operations of the assets entirely on her behalf. The devastating, profound realization crashed over her in a tidal wave of clarity. Blake had not been trying to steal my empire. He had been trying to trick Morgan into signing away her own kingdom. I had walked directly into the federal courthouse, silently endured the vicious public slander, and willingly subjected myself to Blake's brutal psychological torture just to prevent her from accidentally relinquishing her own fortune to a criminal. I had waged a ruthless, uncompromising war against a sociopath solely to protect my daughter from the consequences of her own blind trust. Morgan burst into tears, leaning across the leather chairs to wrap her arms tightly around my neck. She sobbed against my shoulder, finally understanding the absolute limitless depth of a father's protective love. I held her close, smiling softly at Pierce over her shoulder. The deception was dead, the empire was safe, and my daughter was finally ready to take her rightful throne. The quiet hum of a downtown coffee shop provided a stark contrast to the chaotic federal raid that had permanently altered the trajectory of our lives. I sat at a corner table near the window, nursing a black coffee and watching the morning commute flow through the streets of Atlanta. The city moved with its usual relentless energy, entirely indifferent to the spectacular collapse of the Kensington family. I checked my watch just as the heavy glass door swung open. Carmen stepped inside, scanning the room before her eyes locked onto mine. She wore a simple professional blouse and carried a worn leather tote bag projecting the same quiet, unshakable dignity she had displayed at the launch gala. She walked over and took the seat across from me, folding her hands neatly on the table. She looked slightly apprehensive, likely wondering if her covert assistance during Blake's disastrous presentation had somehow violated her employment contract with the event management firm. I did not leave her in suspense. I thanked her directly for her absolute integrity. I explained that in my decades of building a commercial real estate empire, I had encountered thousands of individuals who were perfectly willing to trade their moral compass for a fleeting moment of financial gain or social elevation. Carmen had actively chosen the opposite path. She had risked her own career and personal safety to hand me the detonator to Blake's fraudulent enterprise simply because she recognized a predator and refused to let him win. I reached into my suit jacket and extracted a thick, heavily bound legal folder, sliding it across the polished wooden table. Carmen looked at the document entirely confused before opening the cover. It was not a simple thank you card or a discreet cash reward. It was a comprehensive ironclad employment contract. I informed her that I was officially terminating her current position at the event firm. Effective immediately, she was hired as the chief operations manager for the entire Rollins commercial real estate portfolio. I watched her eyes widen in absolute shock as she read the compensation figures listed on the second page. I had deliberately tripled her previous salary, attaching full executive benefits and a direct reporting line to my daughter. I told Carmen that I could easily hire a dozen Ivy League graduates to manage my properties, but academic pedigrees could never manufacture genuine loyalty. I needed someone with an uncompromising moral foundation to oversee the daily operations of my empire. I needed someone who could spot a parasite from a mile away and possess the courage to sound the alarm. Carmen stared at the numbers, her hands trembling slightly before looking up at me with tears pooling in her eyes. She reached for the silver pen resting on the table and signed her name on the dotted line without a single second of hesitation. The Atlanta sky shifted into a brilliant canvas of bruised purple and burnt orange as the sun slowly dipped below the distant horizon. I stood on the expansive glass-walled balcony of the Rollins flagship skyscraper 50 stories above the bustling financial district. The cool evening wind cut through the lingering heat of the day, carrying the faint rhythmic sounds of the city traffic below. I rested my hands on the cold steel railing, feeling an immense, profound sense of stability radiating through the building's architecture. This was the fortress I had built with decades of relentless labor, and it remained completely untouched by the criminals who had desperately tried to breach its walls. The heavy glass door behind me slid open with a soft mechanical hum. Morgan stepped out onto the terrace carrying 2 ceramic mugs of black coffee. She did not walk with the hesitant, defensive posture she had carried during her engagement to Blake. Her stride was measured, confident, and utterly commanding. She handed me a mug and took her place directly beside me. She did not stand slightly behind me seeking protection, nor did she stand in front of me seeking conflict. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me as an absolute equal. We looked out over the sprawling grid of city lights flickering to life in the gathering twilight. Morgan took a slow sip of her coffee and immediately began discussing our quarterly projections. She detailed a complex, highly lucrative acquisition strategy for a new block of commercial properties in the Midtown sector, outlining her negotiation tactics with flawless, predatory precision. She had spent the last 6 months completely immersing herself in the operational mechanics of the empire I had legally transferred to her years ago. The blind trust was no longer a protective shield. It was a powerful weapon she now wielded with total authority. I listened to my daughter dissect the local market trends, feeling an overwhelming surge of paternal pride. The trauma of Blake's deception had not broken her. It had forged her into a hardened, uncompromising executive. She had learned the brutal realities of wealth and the vital importance of guarding her inner circle. She finished her briefing and turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting the vibrant city lights. She did not ask for my approval or seek my permission to execute the acquisitions. She was simply informing me of the new trajectory of our family legacy. I nodded in absolute agreement, silently acknowledging the permanent shift in our dynamic. The Rollins Empire was finally in the hands of its rightful queen. The storm that had threatened to consume our lives had entirely dissipated, leaving nothing but clear, unobstructed skies in its wake. I stood on the balcony, leaning against the steel railing, letting the profound reality of our victory settle into my bones. There was absolutely zero lingering anger left in my chest. The burning toxic rage that had fueled my silent war against the Kensington family had completely evaporated the moment the federal judge slammed his gavel down on Blake's sentencing. I did not waste another second thinking about Charles and Patricia rotting in their dilapidated low-income apartment, nor did I dwell on Blake pacing the concrete floor of a federal penitentiary. They were entirely erased from my existence, reduced to irrelevant footnotes in the long, victorious history of my family. I felt only the deep, unshakable peace of order restored. The rightful balance of the universe had been aggressively defended and permanently maintained. I looked down at the endless rivers of headlights flowing through the concrete canyons of the city I had helped construct. I thought about the sheer gravitational pull of massive wealth. It possessed an inherent dangerous gravity that constantly threatened to pull the most hollow, manipulative individuals into its orbit. I took a final slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the warm liquid cut through the chill of the evening air. Morgan turned toward me, resting her arms on the railing, silently waiting for my final assessment of the long, brutal campaign we had just survived. I looked out over the glittering skyline and delivered the absolute truth. Money can attract the worst kinds of parasites, but it also buys the absolute truth. And the truth is the only foundation that never cracks. Reflecting on this incredible journey, there is another vital lesson we must take away from this story. True wealth is never defined by the designer labels you wear, the exclusive zip codes you inhabit, or the manufactured prestige you project to the outside world. Real power comes from absolute authenticity and the unshakable courage to protect your own boundaries. We often encounter individuals who present a flawless facade, perfectly calibrated to exploit our generosity, our empathy, and our desire for connection. They weaponize charm and weaponize guilt, slowly draining our resources while convincing us that we are somehow obligated to finance their extravagant illusions. You must learn to ruthlessly evaluate the people you allow into your inner circle. Pay close attention to how they act when they believe no one of consequence is watching. The true character of someone is always revealed in their treatment of those they deem beneath them. Just as the Kensington family exposed their rotten core through their quiet racism and their dismissive arrogance. Never allow anyone to convince you that your legitimate success is merely a tool for their personal convenience. When you detect deception, do not react with immediate emotional outbursts. Silence is your greatest asset. Use that silence to gather your evidence, fortify your position, and align yourself with individuals who demonstrate genuine, unwavering integrity. Cutting toxic people out of your life is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of fundamental defense. Once you eliminate the parasites, you create the necessary space for authentic relationships to thrive. You clear the path for people who will stand shoulder to shoulder with you, treating you as an equal rather than a target. Stand firm in your truth, guard your legacy, and remember that dignity is the one asset that cannot be bought, sold, or stolen. Did you find resonance and meaning in my story today? I would love to hear your thoughts and perspectives on this journey. Which city or country are you currently listening from? Let us meet down in the comments section below and share our own experiences with setting boundaries. If you enjoyed this narrative and found value in the lessons shared, you can directly support me by sending a super thanks right here on the platform. Your generous contributions allow me to continue producing writing and delivering more excellent stories exactly like this one. Thank you so much for your sweet continuous support and your dedicated viewership. I am genuinely looking forward to reading every single one of your comments on the story. On the screen right now, you can see 2 new highly recommended life stories that I personally selected for you. There is so much more highly engaging content waiting for you on my growing channel. Please do not forget to subscribe and immediately turn on your daily notifications. I will be waiting to see you in the very next beautiful life story. Always remember to move forward with profound love, deep gratitude, and absolute respect.